The gunshot shattered the Montana dawn before Wade Harlow could even dismount his horse. A woman's defiant voice rang out from the general store. "I said no, and I meant it," followed by the crack of a rifle butt against wood. Wade's hand moved to his holster by instinct, but he froze when he saw her, standing in the doorway, eyes blazing with fury, facing down 3 armed men without a tremor of fear. In that moment, the drifter who trusted nothing but his stallion felt something dangerous stir in his chest, something he thought died years ago. Welcome to Iron Creek, 1878, where a haunted cowboy meets the one woman fearless enough to make him stay. Follow this tale of danger, redemption, and frontier love to the very end, and comment below with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The Montana Territory stretched endless and unforgiving under the pale April sky, a land where only the stubborn and the desperate carved out lives from rock and wind. Wade Harlow had been both at different times, though now he considered himself neither, just a man passing through the way tumbleweeds pass through, leaving no mark and taking nothing with them. His black stallion, Dust, picked his way down the rutted trail toward Iron Creek with the careful gait of a horse who'd traveled too many miles on too little rest. Wade sat the saddle with the loose-limbed ease of someone who'd spent more nights under stars than under roofs, his hat pulled low against the morning glare, his coat dusty from 3 days on the trail from Helena. He wasn't looking for anything in Iron Creek except maybe a hot meal, a night in a real bed, and some work that would pay enough to keep moving. Towns like this, remote, barely holding on, populated by miners, ranchers, and people running from something, they suited Wade just fine. Nobody asked questions, nobody cared where you came from or where you were headed. That was exactly how Wade Harlow preferred it. The settlement materialized through the cottonwoods like a mirage. A dozen weathered buildings scattered along a single muddy street, smoke rising from chimneys, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer against anvil. It wasn't much, but Wade had seen worse. Hell, he'd lived in worse. He was about to nudge Dust forward when the gunshot cracked across the morning air. Wade's hand was on his Colt before the echo faded, his body coiled tight, every sense suddenly sharp. Dust sidestepped nervously, but Wade held him steady, his eyes scanning the street below. Through the thin morning light, he saw them. 3 men on horseback outside the general store, and in the doorway, a figure that made him look twice. A woman, young, slender, wearing a simple traveling dress that had seen better days. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she held a rifle, not pointed at the men, but gripped firmly across her chest in a way that said she knew how to use it if she needed to. "I said no," her voice carried clearly up the hillside, strong and steady without a hint of fear. "And I meant it. Now get off my property before I make you regret wasting my morning." Wade felt something unfamiliar twist in his chest. Surprise, maybe, or recognition of something he couldn't quite name. Women on the frontier learned to be tough, or they didn't survive, but there was something different about her, the set of her shoulders, the absolute calm in her voice despite being outnumbered 3-1. One of the men, a big fellow with a rust-colored beard, laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. "Your property, lady? You've been here 3 weeks. This land belongs to whoever can hold it, and you sure as hell can't." "My uncle's deed says otherwise," she replied, her voice sharp as a blade. "Recorded at the land office in Virginia City. Legal and binding. Now I won't ask again. Leave." The bearded man leaned forward in his saddle, his hand resting on his gun belt. "Your uncle's dead, sweetheart, and that deed ain't worth the paper it's written on if you can't defend what's yours." Wade should have kept riding, should have minded his own business, collected his pay somewhere else, moved on like he always did. But his hand was already tightening on Dust's reins, his jaw clenched in that old familiar way that meant trouble was coming whether he wanted it or not. The woman's eyes, he could see them now, dark and fierce, never wavered. "Then I guess you'll find out just how well I can defend it." She shifted her rifle just slightly, and suddenly the air on that street changed. The 3 men exchanged glances, and for a moment Wade thought they might actually back down. But then the bearded one spat in the dirt and reached for his gun. Wade didn't think. He just moved. Dust responded instantly to the pressure of his knees, surging forward down the hillside in a controlled slide of hooves and dust. Wade's voice rang out across the street, hard and carrying. I wouldn't do that if I were you, friend. All four figures turned toward him. The three mounted men with expressions ranging from surprise to irritation, and the woman with those fierce dark eyes that locked onto his face with an intensity that nearly made him forget what he was doing. Wade brought Dust to a halt in the middle of the street, his hand resting casually on his thigh just inches from his Colt. He'd learned years ago that the key to winning a fight was often making sure it never started in the first place. Confidence, calm, the absolute certainty that you would finish what they started if they were foolish enough to try. This doesn't concern you, stranger, the bearded man growled. Keep riding. Wade tilted his hat back just enough to meet the man's eyes directly. Well, now that's the thing. I was planning to do just that. But then I heard a lady being bothered, and my mama raised me better than to ignore that kind of situation. Your mama raised you to be stupid then, one of the other men muttered, a thin fellow with nervous eyes. 3-1 ain't good odds for playing hero. 3-2, the woman's voice cut in sharply, and Wade saw her step down from the storefront, her rifle now held in a ready position that suggested she'd used it before. And I'm a very good shot. Wade fought the urge to smile. He kept his eyes on the three men, but he was suddenly intensely aware of her standing there, a stranger stepping up beside him without hesitation, without even knowing his name. The bearded man studied them both for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing over his options. Finally, he spat again and jerked his head toward his companions. This ain't over, Miss Cross. That homestead should have gone to someone who can work it proper, someone who belongs here. I do belong here, she said quietly, but with absolute conviction. And I'm not leaving. The three men wheeled their horses around and rode off down the street, kicking up mud and muttering among themselves. Wade watched them until they disappeared around the bend, then finally turned to look at the woman properly. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25, with delicate features that contradicted the steel in her eyes. Her dress was worn but clean, her hands calloused from work, and now that the danger had passed, he could see the slight tremor in her fingers as she lowered the rifle. Thank you, she said, meeting his gaze directly in a way that most people didn't. Though I should tell you I had the situation handled. Despite himself, Wade felt the corner of his mouth twitch. I don't doubt it, ma'am, but 3-1 seemed poor odds, handled or not. She studied him for a moment, those dark eyes reading him in a way that made Wade want to shift in his saddle. Finally, she extended her hand like a man would. Evelyn Cross, late of Pennsylvania, now of Iron Creek, Montana Territory. Wade hesitated, then leaned down to shake her hand. Her grip was firm, her palm rough from labor. Wade Harlow, late of nowhere in particular, currently just passing through. Passing through, she repeated, and something flickered across her face. Disappointment, maybe, or just resignation. They all say that. The ones who help, I mean. They're always passing through. Before Wade could respond, an older man emerged from the general store, wiping his hands on his apron. His face was creased with worry. Miss Cross, I'm real sorry about that. Ben Harker and his boys, they've been making trouble since you arrived. I should have... It's not your fault, Mr. Chen, Evelyn said, her voice softening. You've been nothing but kind to me, and they're just words and bluster. They'll get tired of it eventually. Wade dismounted, his boots hitting the muddy street with a soft thud. Those men, they local? Mr. Chen, a Chinese immigrant who'd probably seen his own share of frontier prejudice, nodded reluctantly. Ben Harker runs a cattle operation about 10 miles east. He made an offer on Miss Cross's land before she arrived to claim it. Didn't take kindly to being refused. My uncle left me that homestead in his will, Evelyn said, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. It's mine legally. I have the papers. Legal don't always mean much out here, Wade said quietly, more to himself than to her. But she heard it, and when he looked up, he saw understanding in her eyes. The recognition that she knew exactly what he meant, and had probably learned that lesson already in her 3 weeks here. Well, she said, squaring her shoulders in that way that Wade was beginning to recognize as her particular brand of determination. Legal is all I have, so legal is what I'll stand on. Thank you again for your assistance, Mr. Harlow. I wish you safe travels wherever you're heading. She turned to go back into the store, but Mr. Chen cleared his throat. Miss Cross, About your wagon. Evelyn's shoulders sagged slightly, the first real crack in her armor. Right, the wagon. Wade glanced past her and saw it then. An old freight wagon with a broken rear axle, tilted at an awkward angle in the alley beside the store. The wheel had clearly given out, and from the supplies scattered in the wagon bed, it looked like she'd been in the middle of hauling provisions out to her homestead. I was going to fix it myself, Evelyn said, following his gaze. I just need to figure out how the axle mechanism works. Wade walked over to inspect the damage, running his hand along the splintered wood. The wagon was old, probably third or fourth hand, held together more by prayer than carpentry. The axle hadn't just broken, it had shattered. Fixing it would require new wood, proper tools, and at least half a day's work. You can't fix this alone, he said bluntly. Not without a forge and someone who knows what they're doing. Then I'll hire someone, Evelyn replied, that stubborn lift returning to her chin. Nearest carpenter who can handle this is in Virginia City, Mr. Chen said apologetically. 3 days' ride from here. Wade straightened, brushing dust from his hands. He should walk away now, should wish her luck, mount dust, and ride on to the next town where nobody needed saving and nobody made him feel like he was standing on unsteady ground. Instead, he heard himself say, I can fix it. Both Evelyn and Mr. Chen turned to stare at him. I worked on freight wagons in Wyoming, Wade continued, already regretting the words even as they left his mouth. If Mr. Chen can spare some tools and timber, I can have this running by tomorrow evening. I can pay, Evelyn said quickly. Not much, but board and a hot meal is payment enough, Wade interrupted. I was planning to camp outside town anyway. She studied him again with those penetrating dark eyes, and Wade had the uncomfortable feeling she was seeing right through the casual offer to whatever complicated truth lay underneath. But finally, she nodded. Then I accept, Mr. Harlow. Thank you. Mr. Chen clapped his hands together, relieved to have the problem solved. I'll get you what you need. Miss Cross, why don't you show Mr. Harlow where you're staying? He can stable his horse there. As Evelyn led the way down the street, Wade following with dust reins in hand, he tried to figure out exactly when he'd lost control of his own plan. He'd ridden into Iron Creek looking for simple work and a quick exit. Now here he was, agreeing to fix a wagon for a woman he'd just met, who had trouble with local ranchers and eyes that made him forget why he never stayed anywhere long. You don't talk much, Evelyn observed, glancing back at him. Don't have much to say, Wade replied. Yet you rode into someone else's fight without hesitation. Wade shrugged. Didn't seem like a fair fight. Life isn't fair, Mr. Harlow. I learned that when cholera took my parents and 2 brothers in the span of a week. When my uncle, the only family I had left, died before I could even meet him properly. Fair is a luxury people like me can't afford to expect. There was no self-pity in her voice, just statement of fact delivered with the same calm directness she'd used when facing down armed men. Wade found himself respecting that more than he wanted to. Then why come out here? He asked. Why not stay in Pennsylvania where you had whatever you had there? Evelyn stopped walking and turned to face him fully. Her expression was complex, grief and determination, and something else Wade couldn't quite read. Because Pennsylvania had nothing but memories and pity, she said quietly. Because when the lawyer's letter arrived saying my uncle left me land out west, it felt like a door opening when I thought I was staring at walls. Because I'm 26 years old and I've spent my whole life being what everyone expected. The dutiful daughter, the proper lady, the grieving survivor. Out here, I can be something else. I can be myself. Wade held her gaze, and for a moment the street around them seemed to fade away. He understood what she was saying more than she could possibly know. The need to escape, the desperate hope that somewhere else might feel more like home than anywhere you'd been before. And what is that? He asked. Yourself? Evelyn smiled, and it transformed her face from merely pretty to something that made Wade's breath catch. I'm still figuring that out, Mr. Harlow, but I know she's braver than I ever imagined I could be. They reached a small boarding house at the edge of town, run by a widow named Mrs. Talbot, who regarded Wade with the suspicious eye of someone who'd seen too many drifters cause trouble. But Evelyn vouched for him, and within 30 minutes, Wade had dust stabled in the small barn out back and his bedroll stashed in a corner of the tack room. Mrs. Talbot drew the line at letting strange men sleep in her house proper. Over a simple lunch of bread, cheese, cheese and coffee. Evelyn told him about her homestead. Her uncle, Samuel Cross, had been a prospector who'd eventually given up chasing gold to file a claim on 40 acres of prairie land about 5 miles from town. He'd built a small cabin, started a garden, and lived there alone for 3 years before a bad winter and worse pneumonia took him. The lawyer said the cabin needed work, Evelyn admitted, pushing crumbs around her plate. But I didn't realize how much until I actually saw it. The roof has holes. Half the windows are broken. The well needs to be redug. The fences are falling down. Sounds like more than one person can handle, Wade observed. Yes, well, one person is all I have, Evelyn said, that stubborn set returning to her jaw. So one person will have to be enough. Those men this morning, Ben Harker and his crew, they made offers to buy you out. Evelyn nodded. 3 times. Each offer lower than the last, like he thinks I'll get desperate enough to accept pennies on the dollar. But this land is all I have, Mr. Harlow. It's my uncle's legacy and my future. I'm not selling, no matter how difficult they make things. Wade leaned back in his chair, studying her across the rough wooden table. Making things difficult could mean worse than words and threats. Men like Harker, they're used to getting what they want out here. Law is thin on the ground in the territories. I know, Evelyn said quietly. I'm not naive, despite what you might think. I know the risks, but what's my alternative? Go back east with nothing? Become a governess or a seamstress? Or marry some man for security rather than love? She shook her head firmly. No, I'd rather fight for something that's mine, even if the odds are against me. There was steel in her voice that Wade recognized, the steel of someone who'd already lost so much that the possibility of losing more didn't frighten them the way it should. It was dangerous, that kind of fearlessness. It made people reckless. It also made them magnificent. Well, Wade said, draining his coffee, first things first. Let's get your wagon fixed so you can actually get supplies out to that homestead. Then we can worry about everything else. He spent the rest of the afternoon working on the axle, with Mr. Chen providing tools and timber from his storehouse. Evelyn stayed to help, proving she wasn't just tough in spirit, but practical in action, handing him tools before he asked, holding boards steady while he worked, asking intelligent questions about how the mechanics functioned. You're good with your hands, she observed, watching him fit a new brace into place. Wade paused, suddenly aware of her standing close enough that he could smell lavender soap and sun-warmed cotton. Picked it up here and there. When you drift as much as I have, you learn to fix things because you can't always afford to pay someone else. How long have you been drifting? It was a simple question, asked without judgment, but Wade felt his shoulders tense anyway. Long enough. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, then said, My uncle used to say that some people wander because they're looking for something, and some wander because they're running from something. He never could decide which one he was. Wade hammered a nail with more force than necessary. Maybe some people are both. Maybe, Evelyn agreed softly, or maybe they're just waiting to find a reason to stop. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning Wade wasn't ready to examine. He focused on the wagon instead, on the simple solvable problem of wood and metal and making something broken work again. They worked in comfortable silence after that, the afternoon sun slanting long shadows across the street. Other townspeople passed by, curious glances at the stranger helping Miss Cross, a few nods, 1 or 2 outright stares. Wade could feel the gossip starting to form, the questions people would whisper to each other. Who is he? Where'd he come from? What's his business with the Cross woman? Let them wonder. He'd be gone soon enough, and their curiosity would find some other target. But as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Wade found himself moving slower, taking more care with each repair than strictly necessary. Found himself aware of Evelyn beside him, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she concentrated, the quiet competence in her movements, the occasional smile when something he said amused her. Found himself, dangerously, not quite ready for the work to end. By the time darkness fell, they'd made significant progress. The axle was reinforced, new braces installed, and the wheel could be reattached in the morning once the wood glue dried. Wade straightened with a groan, feeling every one of his 32 years in his lower back. You should rest, Evelyn said. Mrs. Talbot is making stew for supper. You'll join us, of course." It wasn't really a question, and Wade found he didn't want to argue anyway. They walked back to the boarding house together through the deepening dusk, past windows glowing with lamplight, past the saloon where piano music and laughter spilled out into the street. Mrs. Talbot's dining room was small but warm. The table set for four: herself, Evelyn, Wade, and a traveling preacher named Reverend Michaels, who was passing through on his way to minister at a mining camp in the hills. The stew was simple but good, thick with potatoes and carrots, and mysterious chunks of meat Wade decided not to examine too closely. Reverend Michaels dominated the conversation with stories of his travels, but Wade found himself only half listening. Instead, he watched Evelyn across the table, the way candlelight softened her features, the genuine interest she showed in the preacher's tales, the quick intelligence in her responses when she spoke. She caught him looking once, and something passed between them, a moment of recognition, of awareness, of possibility. Before she looked away, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Later, lying in his bedroll in the tack room with Dust's quiet breathing nearby, Wade stared up at the rafters and tried to convince himself that tomorrow he'd finish the wagon, collect his payment, and ride out of Iron Creek without looking back. He'd made that promise to himself in a dozen different towns, after a dozen different jobs. Always moving, never staying, never letting himself get tangled up in other people's lives or problems. It was safer that way. Simpler. Less painful when the inevitable happened and everything you cared about got taken away. But as Wade finally drifted toward sleep, he kept seeing dark eyes filled with fierce determination, and hearing a voice that said, "I'd rather fight for something that's mine, even if the odds are against me." And for the first time in years, Wade Harlow wondered what it might feel like to stop running, and whether he even remembered how. Morning came cold and clear, frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds. Wade was up before dawn, checking the wagon repairs by lamplight. The glue had set perfectly, and within an hour he had the wheel reattached and tested. The wagon rolled smooth and steady, ready for whatever rough trail led out to Evelyn's homestead. She appeared as he was finishing, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee, and a determined expression Wade was beginning to recognize meant she'd made a decision about something. "Good morning," she said, handing him one of the cups. "The wagon looks perfect. Thank you." Wade accepted the coffee, the warmth welcome against the morning chill. "Should get you where you need to go." "Yes," Evelyn said. "About that. I have a proposition for you, Mr. Harlow." Wade's guard went up immediately. Propositions meant complications, and complications meant getting involved, and getting involved was exactly what he'd promised himself he wouldn't do. "I'm listening," he said carefully. Evelyn took a breath, meeting his eyes with that direct gaze he was beginning to find both unnerving and compelling. "I need to get supplies out to the homestead and start making the repairs before winter comes again. But the truth is, I'm out of my depth. I can shoot and I can stand up to bullies, but I don't know how to fix a roof or mend fences properly or any of the 100 other things that need doing." "You could hire someone from town," Wade suggested, though even as he said it, he knew what her answer would be. "With what money?" Evelyn shook her head. "I spent nearly everything I had getting here and buying supplies. I can't afford to hire skilled labor for weeks of work." She paused, then continued. "But I can offer room and board, and a small wage once I start selling produce from the garden. If you stayed, just for a few weeks, to help me get the place livable, I could manage after that on my own." Wade should have said no, should have explained that he didn't do few weeks anywhere, that he had somewhere else to be, even though they both knew that was a lie, that he had nowhere to be because nowhere was exactly where he always was. Instead, he found himself asking, "What about Harker and his men? They're not going to give up just because you have help." "Then I'll deal with them," Evelyn said firmly. "I told you, I'm not leaving. This is my land, my future. I'm staying whether you help me or not. I'm just asking for a hand getting started." Wade looked at her, really looked at her, this woman who'd lost everything, traveled halfway across a continent alone, and was now standing in a frontier town with nothing but determination and a broken-down homestead to her name, refusing to quit or compromise or accept defeat. He thought about riding out of Iron Creek today, about putting this town and this woman behind him, about keeping his promise to himself never to stay, never to care, never to risk the kind of pain that came from losing something that mattered. And then he thought about those three men circling her yesterday, about how she'd stood her ground with nothing but a rifle and courage, about how she'd be out at that homestead alone when they came back. Because they would come back, Wade was certain of that. 2 weeks, he heard himself say. I'll stay 2 weeks, help you get the major repairs done, make sure the place is secure. After that, you're on your own. Evelyn's face lit up with a smile that made Wade forget, just for a moment, all the reasons this was a mistake. Thank you, Mr. Harlow, truly. You won't regret it. But as they loaded the wagon with supplies and Wade tied dust to the back, as they said goodbye to Mr. Chen and Mrs. Talbot and started the 5-mile journey out to the homestead, Wade had the sinking feeling that regret was exactly what was waiting for him at the end of this trail. The Montana prairie opened up before them like an ocean of grass, rolling and endless under the enormous sky. Evelyn drove the wagon with competent hands, pointing out landmarks as they went. A lightning-struck tree that marked the boundary of her land, a creek that ran year-round and provided water for the homestead, the distant mountains that looked close but were actually days away. My uncle's letters described all of this, she said, her voice soft with memory. He wrote to me every few months, telling me about the land, about his plans for the future. I think he was lonely out here, but he never admitted it. He just wrote about how beautiful it was, how free he felt. Did you write back? Wade asked. Always, but my letters probably seemed so dull compared to his adventures. Philadelphia society, charity work, church socials? She laughed quietly. He once wrote that he'd take honest dirt and hard work over fancy tea parties any day. At the time, I thought he was just being contrary. Now I understand what he meant. They crested a rise, and Evelyn pulled the wagon to a stop. There, she said simply. Wade followed her gaze and saw it. A small cabin nestled in a shallow valley, sheltered by cottonwood trees with a creek glinting silver beyond it. From this distance, it looked almost picturesque, a frontier dream made real. But as they drew closer, the reality became clear. The cabin roof sagged dangerously in the middle, with visible holes where shingles had blown away. The windows were indeed broken, some covered with boards, others just gaping dark holes. The garden plot was overrun with weeds, and the chicken coop had collapsed entirely. Fences leaned at drunken angles, posts rotted through, wire rusted and broken. Evelyn's face was carefully neutral as she climbed down from the wagon, but Wade saw her hands tremble slightly as she pulled off her gloves. It's worse than you remembered, he said. No, she replied quietly. It's exactly as bad as I remembered. I just kept hoping I'd been wrong. Wade dismounted and walked slowly around the property, taking inventory. The cabin itself was solid enough, good timber, decent construction. But it had been neglected for months, and Montana winters were brutal on anything left unprotected. The roof would need complete replacement, not just patching. The windows would need glass he wasn't sure they could afford. The well had definitely collapsed. 2 weeks won't be enough, he said finally. Evelyn turned to him, and in the full light of the prairie sun, Wade saw fear flicker across her face before she mastered it. How long? Wade pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, doing calculations he wasn't happy about. To make this place livable before winter, weatherproof and secure? He paused, knowing his answer would change everything. 6 weeks? Maybe 8? That's nearly 2 months. I know. That's a lot of time for a man who's just passing through. Wade met her eyes, saw the challenge there, the test. He could back out now, could wish her luck and ride away with a clear conscience, knowing he'd at least tried to warn her what she was facing. But he looked at the cabin again, at this impossible project she was determined to tackle alone, and heard his father's voice from 20 years ago. A man's character is measured by whether he finishes what he starts, Wade, not by whether he starts easy things. Then I guess I'll be passing through slower than usual, Wade said. But I mean it, Miss Cross. After that, I'm gone. I don't stay places. I don't settle down. I help you fix this up, and then I ride on. That's the deal. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. That's the deal. Thank you, Mr. Harlow, for being honest about the timeline and for staying despite it. Don't thank me yet, Wade muttered, already mentally listing everything that needed doing. You might be cursing my name before this is over. But Evelyn smiled, that transformative smile that made something in Wade's chest tighten uncomfortably. I doubt that. Now come on, let's unload these supplies and see just how bad it really is inside. The interior of the cabin was marginally better than the outside, if only because the walls were still standing. One room served as the main living space, with a stone fireplace, a rough table and chairs, and a sleeping area separated by a curtain. A second smaller room had probably been meant for storage but was currently full of her uncle's possessions, tools, books, random odds and ends of a solitary life. Wade started mentally cataloging what they'd need, what they had, what could be salvaged. Beside him, Evelyn did the same, her practical mind clearly working through problems and solutions. They stood there in that broken-down cabin on the edge of nowhere, two strangers who'd met only yesterday, about to spend the next 2 months fixing something that might not be fixable, building something that might not last. And despite every promise Wade had made to himself about staying detached, staying temporary, staying safe, he felt something dangerous beginning to grow in his chest. Hope. It terrified him more than any gunfight ever had. The first 3 days passed in a blur of physical labor that left both of them exhausted and covered in dust by sundown. Wade started with the roof, knowing that everything else was pointless if rain and snow could pour straight into the cabin. He worked methodically, tearing away rotten shingles and damaged beams while Evelyn hauled water from the creek, prepared meals over the fireplace, and began the overwhelming task of clearing weeds from what had once been her uncle's garden. They fell into an unspoken rhythm, working separately but aware of each other, speaking only when necessary, both too tired at the end of each day for much conversation beyond practical matters. Wade would wash up at the creek while Evelyn prepared dinner. They'd eat in companionable silence, and then Wade would retreat to the small barn where he'd made a rough camp, leaving Evelyn the cabin to herself. It was professional, distant, exactly how Wade preferred things. But on the fourth morning, something shifted. Wade was on the roof replacing support beams when he heard Evelyn's frustrated cry from the garden. He looked down to see her standing amid the weeds, staring at her hands with an expression of such dejection that he found himself climbing down the ladder before he'd consciously decided to move. "What's wrong?" he called as he approached. Evelyn held up her hands, and even from several feet away, Wade could see they were blistered and bleeding. She'd been pulling weeds with her bare hands for days, and her soft eastern skin had finally given up the fight. "I'm being ridiculous," she said, swiping at her eyes with the back of her wrist. "It's just blisters, nothing worth crying over." "You're not crying over blisters," Wade said quietly. "You're crying because everything is harder than you expected, and you're doing it alone and wondering if you made a terrible mistake coming here." Evelyn's head snapped up, those dark eyes meeting his with surprise. "How did you—" "Because I've been there," Wade interrupted. "Different circumstances, but I know what it feels like when the weight of everything crashes down at once." For a moment, Evelyn just stared at him, and Wade realized it was the most personal thing he'd said to her since they'd met. He'd carefully kept every conversation surface level, every exchange focused on the work at hand. But something about her standing there with bloody hands and tears on her cheeks broke through his defenses. "Come on," he said, gesturing toward the cabin. "Let's get those cleaned up before they get infected." Inside, Wade found the small medical kit he'd noticed among her uncle's things. Evelyn sat at the table while he pumped water into a basin, and when he turned back to her, she was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I can manage." I know you can," Wade replied, pulling a chair close to hers. "But managing alone when you don't have to is just stubborn pride." A smile flickered across her face. "You would know about stubborn pride, Mr. Harlow." "That I would, Miss Cross." He took her hands gently, examining the damage. The blisters were bad. Several had burst and were raw and angry looking. Wade cleaned them carefully with water and whiskey, trying to ignore how small her hands felt in his, how she caught her breath when the alcohol stung but didn't pull away. "You need gloves," he said, focusing on wrapping clean cloth around her palms. "And you need to let these heal before you do any more work with your hands." "I can't just stop working," Evelyn protested. "There's too much to do." Then work with me on the roof for a few days. I need someone to hand me tools and hold boards steady. That won't hurt your hands as much as digging in the dirt." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Why are you being so kind to me?" The question caught Wade off guard. He finished tying off the bandage and sat back, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, how the morning light through the window caught in her dark hair. "I'm not kind," he said roughly. "I'm just practical. If you get an infection, you can't work. And if you can't work, this place doesn't get fixed. And if this place doesn't get fixed, I wasted my time staying." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but Evelyn didn't challenge him. She just smiled slightly and said, "Well, thank you for being so practical then." From that day forward, something changed between them. Evelyn joined Wade on the roof, and as they worked side by side under the vast Montana sky, they began to talk, really talk, not just about tasks and supplies, but about their lives, their pasts, the things that had brought them to this remote place. Evelyn told him about growing up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a successful merchant who'd lost everything when a business partner embezzled their money. About how her father's shame had driven him to drink and her mother to an early grave. About watching cholera tear through their neighborhood, helpless to save her brothers. "The worst part wasn't the dying," she said one afternoon, her voice quiet as she handed Wade a hammer. "It was how fast everything changed. One month we were a family, making plans, arguing about silly things. The next month, I was alone. Just alone." Wade drove a nail with more force than necessary, feeling her words resonate in his chest like an echo. "How old were you?" 23. Old enough to know better than to expect life to be fair, but young enough to be shocked when it wasn't. She paused, staring out at the prairie stretching endlessly around them. Everyone wanted to help after. Neighbors, church ladies, distant relatives. But their help came with expectations. "Marry this widower who needs a mother for his children. Come work as a companion for this elderly aunt. Let us find you a suitable position." "Suitable meaning controllable," Wade said. "Exactly." Evelyn met his eyes, and he saw understanding there, the recognition of someone else who'd chosen freedom over security. "My Uncle Samuel's letter arrived 6 months after the last funeral. He wrote that he was getting older, that Montana winters were hard, that maybe he should come back east and settle near family again. I wrote back and told him not to. Told him about losing everyone, about feeling trapped by other people's kindness. He wrote back immediately and said if I ever wanted a fresh start, I had a home waiting in Montana." "But he died before you could get here," Wade finished quietly. Evelyn nodded. "The lawyer's letter reached me 3 weeks later. Uncle Samuel had pneumonia, refused to leave his homestead for treatment in town, and died alone in this cabin." She touched the rough timber of the roof they were repairing. "I keep thinking if I'd come sooner, if I hadn't waited so long trying to be sensible and proper, maybe he wouldn't have been alone at the end." Wade stopped working and turned to face her fully. "You can't think like that. The guilt of what you might have done differently, it'll eat you alive if you let it." Something in his voice made Evelyn study him more closely. "You sound like you know from experience." Wade looked away, but he'd already said too much to back away completely. "I do." They worked in silence for a while, and Wade thought maybe she'd let it drop. But then Evelyn said softly, "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but if you need someone to listen, someone who won't judge or pity, I'm here." Wade's hand stilled on the shingle he was positioning. He hadn't talked about his past in years, hadn't trusted anyone enough to share the pieces of himself he kept locked away. But something about this woman, about the way she'd shared her own pain without asking for anything in return, made him want to try. "I had a family once," he said finally, the words rough and unfamiliar. "A wife, a daughter. Sarah was 4 years old, smart as a whip, always laughing." He paused, forcing himself to continue. "We lived in Kansas, had a small farm. I was gone overnight helping a neighbor with a barn raising when raiders came through. They burned half the homesteads in the county." Evelyn's sharp intake of breath told him she understood what was coming, but she didn't interrupt. "My wife Emma tried to hide with Sarah in the root cellar, but the fire spread too fast. By the time I got home..." Wade's voice broke, and he had to stop, had to breathe through the tightness in his chest that never fully went away. "I buried them both under the oak tree where Sarah used to play. and then I rode away and never went back." "How long ago?" Evelyn asked gently. 8 years. Wade finally looked at her, expecting to see pity in her eyes. Instead, he saw understanding, grief, the recognition of someone who knew that kind of loss never truly healed. "I've been moving ever since. Different towns, different jobs, never staying long enough to care about anything, because caring means losing, and I can't—" He stopped, shaking his head. "I won't go through that again." Evelyn reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and placed her bandaged hand over his. The touch was light, but it burned like a brand. "I'm sorry," she said simply, "for your loss, for your pain, for the fact that the world took something precious from you." She squeezed his hand gently. "But Wade, and I hope you'll forgive me for saying this, running from loss doesn't make it hurt less. It just means you're hurting alone." Wade wanted to argue, wanted to pull his hand away and rebuild the walls she'd just breached. But her touch was warm, her eyes were kind without being pitying, and for the first time in 8 years, he felt something other than the constant ache of grief. He felt seen. They didn't talk more about it that day. Wade went back to work, and Evelyn didn't push, didn't try to extract more confessions or offer empty platitudes. She just stayed beside him, handing him tools when needed, and her presence was somehow both comfortable and terrifying. That evening, as they sat outside the cabin watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Evelyn said quietly, "Thank you for telling me. I know it wasn't easy." Wade nodded, not trusting his voice. "For what it's worth," she continued, "I think your Sarah would want you to be happy again. Children love so purely, they never want the people they love to suffer." Wade's throat tightened. "I don't know if I remember how to be happy." "Then maybe," Evelyn said, turning to look at him with those impossibly dark eyes, "you just need to practice. Start small. Notice something good each day. A beautiful sunset, a meal that tastes right, the satisfaction of work done well." She smiled slightly. "A friend who understands." "Is that what we are?" Wade asked. "Friends?" "I'd like to think so. Unless you have another word for two people fixing a broken house and trying to fix themselves at the same time." Wade felt a smile tug at his lips despite himself. "Friends works." "Good," Evelyn said, standing and brushing off her skirt. "Then as your friend, I'm telling you that dinner is ready, and if you don't come eat it now, I'm feeding it to the crows." The days that followed fell into an easier rhythm. With Evelyn's hands healing, Wade taught her the basics of carpentry, how to measure cuts, how to read the grain of wood, how to drive a nail straight. She was a quick learner, practical, and unafraid of hard work, though she lacked the strength for some of the heavier tasks. In turn, she taught him things he hadn't expected: how to identify edible plants growing wild near the creek, how to make bread that didn't taste like boot leather, how to laugh at small frustrations instead of letting them build into rage. They talked while they worked, comfortable conversations about everything and nothing. Evelyn told stories about Philadelphia society that made Wade laugh: pompous merchants, ridiculous fashion, the endless social rules that governed every interaction. Wade shared tales from his years of drifting, strange towns, stranger characters, the odd jobs that had taught him his varied skills. But they also fell into companionable silences, working side by side without needing to fill every moment with words. Wade found himself noticing small things about her: the way she hummed while she worked, the streak of sawdust in her hair by mid-afternoon, the determined set of her jaw when she tackled something difficult. And sometimes he'd catch her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something warm and wondering that made his pulse quicken in ways he'd thought were dead with Emma. It was dangerous, this growing closeness. Wade knew it, felt it, tried to maintain distance. But Evelyn had a way of slipping past his defenses without even trying. A smile, a laugh, a moment of shared understanding that made him forget why he'd built walls in the first place. 2 weeks became 3, and the cabin transformed slowly under their combined efforts. The roof was solid now, weatherproof and strong. They'd replaced all the broken windows with glass Wade managed to buy from a traveling merchant. The door hung straight and closed properly. The fireplace drew cleanly after Wade repaired the chimney. They were sitting on the front porch one evening, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, when Evelyn said, "You're good at this. Building, fixing things. Did you do this kind of work before?" She stopped, clearly uncertain how to finish. "Before Kansas?" Wade finished for her. It was getting easier to talk about, though it still hurt. "Some. My father was a carpenter in Missouri. I learned from him growing up. After I married Emma, I thought I wanted to be a farmer, but turns out I'm better at building things than growing them." "Your father, is he—" "Dead. Years ago. My mother, too. No siblings." Wade's voice was matter-of-fact. "I'm the last of my line, I guess." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "Me too. Last of mine." Strange to think about, isn't it? All those generations of people living and loving and making families, and then just us. The end of the line. "Unless you have children," Wade pointed out. "Unless," Evelyn agreed. "Though that seems unlikely at the moment, given I'm living alone on a remote homestead with no prospects in sight." Wade felt something twist in his chest at her words. The thought of Evelyn with someone else, of another man eventually riding up to this homestead and winning her affections, bothered him more than it should. "What about you?" Evelyn asked. "Do you ever think about marrying again? Having more children?" "No," Wade said immediately, his response automatic. But then he paused, reconsidering. "I mean, I didn't. For years, the idea of replacing Emma and Sarah felt like a betrayal. And now?" Wade turned to look at her, really look at her in the fading light. "Now I'm starting to think maybe it wouldn't be replacing them. Maybe it would just be living again." Something flickered in Evelyn's eyes. Hope, maybe, or possibility. But before either of them could say more, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Wade was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his gun. 3 riders emerged from the twilight, and even before they got close enough to see clearly, Wade knew who they were: Ben Harker and his men. "Stay behind me," Wade said quietly to Evelyn, but she was already standing beside him, her rifle in her hands, her expression calm and determined. The 3 men reined in about 20 feet from the cabin, their horses stamping and snorting. In the dying light, Harker's bearded face looked almost demonic, his eyes reflecting the last red rays of sunset. "Well now," Harker drawled, "looks like you've been busy, Miss Cross. Place almost looks livable." "It is livable," Evelyn replied evenly. "And it's private property. You're trespassing." Harker laughed, the sound carrying an edge that made Wade's muscles tense. "Still playing the legal card, are we? Still think a piece of paper means something out here?" His eyes shifted to Wade. "And you're still hanging around, stranger. Must be mighty good pay for a drifter to stay this long." "I'm paid well enough," Wade said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I stay as long as the job takes, which means you should probably turn around and leave before this gets unpleasant." One of Harker's men, the thin, nervous one from the general store, shifted in his saddle. "Ben, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Pike," Harker snapped. He leaned forward, his saddle creaking. "Here's how this is going to work, Miss Cross. You've had your fun playing frontier woman. But winter's coming, and when those first blizzards hit, you're going to be trapped out here alone, cold, hungry, scared. So I'm making you one final offer, $500 for the land and everything on it, more than fair." "No," Evelyn said simply. "Think carefully," Harker warned. "Because once I ride away tonight, the offer's gone. And accidents happen out here on the frontier, fires, animals getting into food stores, wells getting contaminated. Terrible shame when these things happen to folks living all alone." Wade's hand tightened on his gun, but Evelyn spoke before he could. Her voice was ice-cold and absolutely steady. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Harker?" "I'm just pointing out the dangers of frontier living, ma'am, especially for women on their own." "She's not on her own," Wade heard himself say, the words coming out before he'd thought them through. "And if anything happens to this property, any accidents, any misfortunes, anything at all, I'll know exactly where to come looking for answers. Are we clear?" The air between them crackled with tension. Harker's hand moved toward his gun, and Wade's heartbeat steadied into that dangerous calm that came before violence. He'd been in this position before, had learned to read men, to know when they'd back down and when they'd draw. Harker was close to drawing. But then Evelyn did something that surprised everyone. She raised her rifle smoothly and fired a single shot into the ground directly between Harker's horse's front hooves. The animal reared in panic, nearly throwing its rider, and the other two horses shied violently. "That was a warning," Evelyn said calmly, already levering another round into the chamber. "The next shot won't be aimed at the ground. Now get off my property before I demonstrate just how well my uncle taught me to shoot." For a moment, Wade thought Harker might actually be foolish enough to try something. But the man got his horse under control, his face twisted with rage, and spat into the dirt. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Yes," Evelyn said quietly. "It is. You just haven't accepted it yet, but you will. Now leave." Harker jerked his horse's head around, and the three men rode off into the gathering darkness, their angry mutters fading into the night. Wade and Evelyn stood silent, listening until the hoofbeats disappeared completely. Then Evelyn's hand started to shake. Wade took the rifle from her gently, setting it aside, and without thinking pulled her into his arms. She came willingly, pressing her face against his chest, her whole body trembling with delayed reaction. "That was incredibly brave and incredibly stupid," Wade said, his voice rough. "You could have gotten us both killed." "I know," Evelyn whispered, "but I couldn't let him think he could intimidate me. I couldn't show weakness." "You could have let me handle it?" Evelyn pulled back enough to look up at him, and Wade realized he was still holding her, his arms wrapped around her waist, her hands clutching his shirt. "You're leaving in a few weeks, Wade. I need to be able to handle men like Harker on my own." The words hit him harder than they should have. She was right, of course. He'd promised to leave once the cabin was fixed. He'd made it clear from the start that he didn't stay anywhere long. But standing there with Evelyn in his arms, her courage and vulnerability wrapped together, the thought of riding away and leaving her to face Harker alone made something dark and protective surge in his chest. "Wade?" Evelyn's voice was tentative. "Why did you tell him I wasn't alone?" Wade looked down at her face tilted up to his in the starlight, and knew he was standing at a crossroads. He could step back now, rebuild his walls, stick to the plan. Or he could tell her the truth, that somewhere over the past 3 weeks she'd become important to him in ways that terrified him. "Because," he said slowly, "you're not alone. Not as long as I'm here. But you're leaving soon. Maybe I could stay a bit longer. Make sure Harker gets the message that you're not giving up." Evelyn's eyes searched his face. "Is that the only reason you'd stay?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Wade's heart hammered against his ribs. He should lie, should keep things simple. But looking into her eyes, he found he couldn't. "No," he admitted quietly. "It's not the only reason." "Then what's the other reason?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Wade lifted one hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I think you know. I want to hear you say it." Wade took a shaky breath. "I'm staying because I'm not ready to leave you yet. Because working beside you, eating meals with you, talking with you, it's the first time in 8 years I've felt like I might be able to live instead of just survive. And that scares the hell out of me, Evelyn." Tears glimmered in her eyes, catching starlight. "Why does it scare you?" "Because caring about someone means losing them eventually. Because I already lost everything once and barely survived it. Because," his voice broke, "because I'm starting to care about you. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to risk that kind of pain again." Evelyn reached up and placed her palm against his chest, over his heart. "What if I told you I'm scared too? What if I said I've been afraid every single day since you arrived? Afraid you'll leave? Afraid you'll stay? Afraid of what I'm feeling for you?" "What are you feeling?" Wade asked, though he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. "Like maybe I wasn't just running to something when I came to Montana," Evelyn said softly. "Maybe I was also running toward someone. I just didn't know it until a certain stubborn cowboy rode into my life and refused to let me face everything alone." Wade's breath caught. They were standing so close now, her face tilted up to his hand still cradling her cheek. He could feel her heartbeat through her dress, rapid and strong, matching his own. "This is a mistake," he whispered, even as he leaned closer. "We're both running from grief, and we're going to mess this up." "Probably," Evelyn agreed, her lips so close to his he could feel her breath. "But maybe some mistakes are worth making." Wade closed the final distance between them, capturing her mouth with his in a kiss that started gentle and questioning but quickly deepened into something fierce and desperate. Evelyn's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and Wade wrapped both arms around her, lifting her slightly as the kiss became an affirmation of everything they'd been dancing around for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Wade rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't know how to let someone in again." "Then we'll figure it out together," Evelyn said. "One day at a time. No promises about forever. Just today. And tomorrow. And the day after that." Wade pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "I'm still leaving eventually. You know that, right? I'm not a settler, Evelyn. I can't promise I'll stay forever." Something flickered across her face, hurt, maybe, or resignation, but she nodded. "I know. And I'm not asking for forever. I'm just asking for now, for however long you can give me." It should have been enough, should have made things easier, having the boundaries clear. But looking at her brave face, seeing the way she was offering him her heart, even knowing he might break it, Wade felt something crack open inside him, something that had been frozen solid for 8 long years. "Come on," he said roughly, stepping back and taking her hand. "Let's go inside. It's getting cold out here." They walked into the cabin together, and Wade built up the fire while Evelyn prepared tea. Neither of them spoke much, but the silence was comfortable, companionable. When Evelyn brought him a steaming cup and sat beside him on the rough bench he'd built, close enough that their shoulders touched, Wade felt something he hadn't felt in nearly a decade. He felt like he might be home. They talked late into the night, the conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. Evelyn told him her dreams for the homestead, expanding the garden, maybe getting chickens and a milk cow, building a small barn. Wade listened and found himself making suggestions, pointing out where certain things might work best, offering ideas he had no business offering if he was really planning to leave. "You could have a good life here," he said finally. "Once everything's fixed up, once you get established. It's hard work, but you're not afraid of that." "What about you?" Evelyn asked. "What kind of life do you want, Wade? Not just surviving and drifting, but really living." Wade stared into the fire, watching flames dance over logs. "I don't know anymore. I thought I wanted to keep moving, stay unattached. But lately," he stopped, then continued, "lately I'm wondering if maybe moving all the time was just another way of being stuck." Evelyn's hand found his in the firelight. "Then maybe it's time to stop wondering and start trying something different." Wade looked down at their joined hands, at the way her smaller fingers fit perfectly between his. "And if I try and fail, if I hurt you?" "Then we'll both survive it," Evelyn said firmly. "We've both survived worse. But Wade, what if you don't fail? What if this actually works? Aren't you even a little bit curious about that possibility?" He was. God help him, he was more than curious. He was starting to hope, and hope was the most dangerous thing Wade Harlow could feel. But looking at Evelyn's face in the firelight, seeing the courage and vulnerability there, Wade made a decision. Maybe it was the wrong decision. Maybe he'd regret it. But for the first time in 8 years, he was going to take a chance on something other than the open trail and the promise of nowhere. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's see what happens. But Evelyn, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "If I start to leave, if I get scared and try to run, don't let me. Call me on it. Make me stay and face whatever I'm afraid of. Can you do that?" Evelyn squeezed his hand. "I can do that, but you have to promise me the same thing. If I start putting up walls or pushing you away because I'm scared of losing you, don't let me. Make me be brave." "Deal," Wade said, and sealed it with another kiss that left them both breathless. When Wade finally left for the barn that night, later than usual, he paused at the cabin door and looked back. Evelyn stood in the doorway, silhouetted by firelight, and something in Wade's chest expanded with an emotion he hadn't let himself feel in years. For 8 years, he'd been running from home. Maybe it was time to start running toward it instead. The days that followed their first kiss transformed the homestead into something more than just a building project. Wade found himself working with renewed purpose, not just to make the cabin livable, but to make it beautiful, adding small touches he'd never have bothered with before. A wooden peg rack near the door for Evelyn's coat, a proper shelf above the fireplace for her books, a bench outside where they could sit and watch the sunset together. Evelyn noticed every addition, her eyes lighting up with pleasure that made Wade's efforts feel worthwhile in ways simple wages never had. She responded in kind, cooking meals that were more than just fuel, mending his shirts without being asked, leaving wildflowers in a jar on the table that brought color and life to the rough cabin interior. They were building something together, Wade realized. Not just a home, but a life. And the realization terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. 2 more weeks passed in this careful dance of growing intimacy. They worked side by side during the day, their hands brushing as they passed tools, their eyes meeting over shared jokes. In the evenings, they sat close by the fire, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories and silences. Wade told her about his childhood in Missouri, about learning carpentry from his father and dreaming of adventure beyond the workshop. Evelyn shared memories of her mother teaching her to read, of her brother's mischief, of the life she'd lost to disease and poverty. And slowly, carefully, they began to heal each other's wounds without even realizing they were doing it. But the peace couldn't last forever. Wade was repairing the fence line one morning when he spotted a rider approaching from town. He straightened, one hand moving instinctively toward his gun, but relaxed when he recognized the horse. It belonged to Mr. Chen from the general store. The older man reined in near where Wade was working, his face grave. "Mr. Harlow, I need to speak with you, privately." Wade glanced toward the cabin where Evelyn was working in the garden, then nodded. They walked far enough away that she wouldn't overhear, and Mr. Chen dismounted, his hands twisting the reins nervously. "What's wrong?" Wade asked. "There was a U.S. Marshal in town yesterday," Mr. Chen said quietly. "Marshal Coleman. He was asking questions about you." Every muscle in Wade's body went rigid. "What kind of questions?" "About your past, about whether you'd been traveling with anyone, about—" Mr. Chen hesitated, then continued, "about your connection to the Braxton Gang." Wade's blood ran cold. The Braxton Gang. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 5 years, hadn't let himself think about that dark chapter of his life. After Emma and Sarah died, Wade had spent 2 years drowning his grief in whiskey and bad decisions. For 6 months of that time, he'd ridden with Frank Braxton's crew, not as a true outlaw, but as someone who didn't care enough about consequences to say no when they needed an extra gun. He'd never killed anyone during that time, never participated in anything truly violent, but he'd been there. He'd ridden with them, shared their camps, turned a blind eye to their crimes, because his own pain was too overwhelming to care about anyone else's suffering. When he'd finally sobered up enough to realize what he'd become, Wade had left in the middle of the night and never looked back. He'd spent the last 5 years trying to outrun that mistake, moving from town to town, never staying long enough for his past to catch up. "What did you tell him?" Wade asked, his voice tight. "Nothing," Mr. Chen said firmly. "I said I didn't know anything about your past, which is the truth. But Mr. Harlow, he knows you're here. He's coming back tomorrow with a deputy. He wants to talk to you about something." Wade's mind raced. A marshal tracking him down couldn't mean anything good. Even if Wade hadn't committed any major crimes himself, association with the Braxton Gang could land him in prison. At minimum, it would destroy whatever chance he had at a normal life, whatever chance he had with Evelyn. "Thank you for the warning," Wade said. "I appreciate the risk you took riding out here." Mr. Chen nodded. "Miss Cross is a good woman. She doesn't deserve to be hurt by whatever trouble you're carrying." He met Wade's eyes directly. "Are you planning to run?" Wade looked toward the cabin, where Evelyn had straightened from her garden work and was watching them with obvious curiosity. The smart thing would be to saddle dust tonight and disappear before the marshal arrived. Cut his losses, protect himself, keep moving the way he'd always done. But he'd made Evelyn a promise, that he wouldn't run without facing his fear first. And more than that, he realized with sudden clarity that he was tired of running. Tired of letting his past chase him from place to place. Tired of choosing safety over the possibility of something real. "No," Wade said finally, "I'm not running. Whatever the marshal wants, I'll face it." "Even if it means jail?" "Even then." Wade's jaw tightened. "I'm done running from my mistakes." After Mr. Chen left, Wade walked slowly back to the cabin, trying to figure out how to tell Evelyn. She was waiting on the porch, concern evident in her eyes. "What did Mr. Chen want?" she asked. Wade sat beside her on the bench he'd built, his hands clasped between his knees. "There's something I need to tell you, something about my past that I should have mentioned before." Evelyn's expression grew wary, but she nodded. "I'm listening." Wade took a deep breath and told her everything, about the 2 lost years after his family died, about riding with the Braxton gang, about the crimes he'd witnessed and the guilt he'd carried ever since. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her face carefully neutral, and when he finished, the silence stretched between them like a chasm. "So you were an outlaw," she said finally. "Technically, yes, though I never killed anyone, never robbed anyone myself. I was just there. Which maybe makes it worse because I knew what they were doing and I didn't stop them. And now a marshal is coming for you. Tomorrow. Mr. Chen said he wants to talk to me about something." Wade turned to face her fully. "Evelyn, I understand if this changes things between us. I understand if you want me to leave before he gets here. I won't blame you." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the prairie. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "When I decided to come to Montana, everyone back east told me I was making a mistake. They said the frontier was full of dangerous men, criminals, drifters who couldn't be trusted. They said I'd be killed, or worse, within a month." "They might have been right," Wade said quietly. "No," Evelyn turned to him, her dark eyes fierce. "They were wrong. Because yes, there are dangerous men out here. Ben Harker proved that. But there are also good men who've made mistakes. Men who've suffered and survived and are trying to build something better. Men like you, Wade." "You don't know what I did. I know what you're doing now," Evelyn interrupted. "I know you've spent weeks helping me repair this homestead when you could have left at any time. I know you stood up to Harker when you had no obligation to protect me. I know you've been honest with me, even when the truth is painful." She took his hand in both of hers. "Whatever you did 5 years ago, you're not that person anymore. And I'm not going to judge you for grief-driven mistakes when I've been one bad day away from similar choices myself." Wade felt his throat tighten. "The marshal might arrest me. I might not have a choice about leaving." "Then we'll face that if it happens," Evelyn said firmly. "But Wade, promise me you won't run. Promise me you'll at least hear what he has to say before you make any decisions." "I already promised Mr. Chen I wouldn't run," Wade said. "I'm done running, Evelyn. Whatever comes, I'll face it." She leaned forward and kissed him softly, a kiss that tasted like trust and faith and possibilities he didn't deserve. "Then we'll face it together." That night, Wade barely slept. He lay in the barn staring at the rafters, playing through scenarios in his mind. Best case, the marshal just wanted information about Frank Braxton's current whereabouts and would let Wade go. Worst case, he'd be arrested and hanged for crimes he'd witnessed but never reported. Most likely case fell somewhere in between, jail time maybe, or forced cooperation in exchange for leniency. When dawn finally came, Wade was already up and working, repairing fence posts with aggressive efficiency born of nervous energy. Evelyn brought him coffee and breakfast, but didn't try to make conversation, seeming to understand he needed space to think. The marshal arrived mid-morning, riding in with a younger deputy at his side. Marshal Coleman was a weathered man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to be easily fooled. The deputy looked barely 20, eager and nervous in equal measure. Wade set down his tools and walked forward to meet them, acutely aware of Evelyn standing on the cabin porch behind him, her rifle within easy reach. "Wade Harlow?" the marshal asked, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "That's me. Marshal Coleman. This is Deputy Barnes. We need to have a conversation about Frank Braxton and his gang." Wade nodded slowly. "I figured that's what this was about. You want to arrest me?" "That depends," Coleman said, his eyes shrewd, "on whether you're willing to help us stop them from robbing the bank in Iron Creek next week." Of all the things Wade had expected to hear, that wasn't one of them. He stared at the marshal, momentarily speechless. "We've been tracking the Braxton gang for 6 months," Coleman continued. "Every time we get close, they slip away. But 2 days ago, we intercepted a message indicating they're planning to hit Iron Creek's bank on Friday. It's a big job, They're expecting a gold shipment from the Virginia City mines. What does this have to do with me? Wade asked, though he already knew. You rode with them. You know how Frank thinks, how he plans jobs, who he trusts. Coleman leaned forward in his saddle. We need someone on the inside, Mr. Harlow. Someone who can get close enough to Frank to find out the details of the plan so we can stop it before innocent people get killed. You want me to infiltrate my former gang, Wade said flatly. Pretend I'm still the same broken man I was 5 years ago, get Frank to trust me again, and then betray him to you. Yes, Coleman said bluntly. That's exactly what I want. And if I refuse, then I arrest you right now as an accessory to 6 bank robberies, 4 stagecoach holdups, and 2 murders. You'll hang within the month. The marshal's expression was implacable. Your choice, Mr. Harlow. Help us and walk away clean, or refuse and face justice for your past crimes. Wade's hands clenched into fists. I never killed anyone. But you rode with men who did. You shared their camps, their supplies, the profits from their crimes. That makes you guilty under the law. Coleman paused. I've read your file, Mr. Harlow. I know about your wife and daughter. I know the grief that drove you to bad decisions. And frankly, I don't want to hang a man who is trying to drown his sorrows. But I will if I have to, because stopping Frank Braxton is more important than one drifter's redemption. Wade? Evelyn's voice came from behind him, soft and worried. Wade turned to look at her, saw the fear and trust warring in her eyes. She'd promised they'd face this together, but this decision was his alone to make. He could refuse, get arrested, and at least Evelyn would be safe from whatever violence was coming to Iron Creek. Or he could agree, face his past one final time, and risk everything, including his life, for a chance at a clean slate. If I do this, Wade said slowly, turning back to Coleman, I need your guarantee that Miss Cross and her property are protected. I need deputies watching this homestead while I'm gone, making sure Ben Harker or anyone else doesn't use my absence to cause trouble. Done, Coleman agreed immediately. Deputy Barnes will stay here personally. And if I succeed, if I give you the information you need and help you stop the robbery, my record is cleared completely. No future arrests, no outstanding warrants, nothing hanging over my head. You have my word, Coleman said. Help us stop Frank Braxton, and you're a free man. Wade looked at Evelyn again. She'd moved closer, close enough that he could see tears glistening in her eyes, even though her expression remained strong. Don't do this if you don't want to, she said quietly. We'll figure something else out. We'll run if we have to. Wade shook his head. No more running. You taught me that. He reached out and took her hand, not caring that the marshal and deputy were watching. I have to do this, Evelyn, not just to clear my record, but because innocent people in Iron Creek are going to die if I don't, and I'm done being the man who turns away when he could help. Then I'm coming with you, Evelyn said firmly. Absolutely not, Wade and Coleman said in unison. Frank Braxton won't trust me if I show up with a woman, Wade continued. And it's too dangerous. These men are killers, Evelyn. Then be careful, she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. Come back to me, Wade Harlow, because I'm not done figuring out what we are yet. Wade pulled her close, ignoring their audience, and kissed her hard. I'll come back, he promised against her lips. I swear it. 2 hours later, Wade was riding away from the homestead with Marshal Coleman, leaving Evelyn standing on the porch with Deputy Barnes beside her. He looked back once and saw her raise a hand in farewell, and the image seared itself into his memory, a promise of what was waiting if he survived this. The ride to where Coleman's informants had last spotted the Braxton gang took 2 days. They camped rough, and Coleman used the time to drill Wade on what he needed to find out: timing, number of men involved, escape routes, anything that would give the lawmen an advantage. Frank's smart, Wade warned. He doesn't trust easy, especially not someone who disappeared without a word 5 years ago. Then you'd better have a good story ready, Coleman said. One that explains where you've been and why you're back now. Wade spent the rest of the ride preparing his story, falling back into old patterns of thinking, remembering the man he'd been when grief made him reckless. It was like putting on a coat he'd thrown away years ago. Uncomfortable, but familiar. They reached the abandoned mining camp where Frank's gang was supposedly holed up just before sunset. Coleman pulled up about a mile out, hidden in a stand of trees. This is where I leave you, the marshal said. You ride in alone, convince Frank to let you back in, and get us the information we need. We'll be watching, but we can't risk being seen. And if Frank decides to shoot me instead of welcoming me back? Coleman's expression was grim. Then you better be real persuasive, real fast. Wade checked his gun, made sure his knife was secure, and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. He thought instead about Evelyn, about the life they'd started building, about the promise he'd made to come back to her. One more thing, Coleman said as Wade prepared to ride out. Frank's gotten worse since you left. Meaner, more violent. Don't underestimate him just because you knew him before. Wade nodded and rode toward the mining camp, his heart hammering against his ribs. As he approached, two men stepped out from cover, rifles pointed at his chest. "That's far enough, stranger," one called. "State your business." "I'm looking for Frank Braxton," Wade called back. "Name's Wade Harlow. Tell him the ghost from Kansas has come back to settle an old debt." The men exchanged glances, and one disappeared into the camp while the other kept Wade covered. 5 minutes that felt like hours passed before the man returned with someone Wade recognized immediately, despite the years. Frank Braxton looked older, harder, with new scars on his face and a coldness in his eyes that Wade didn't remember. But his voice was the same when he spoke, smooth and dangerous as a snake's hiss. "Well, well," Frank drawled, walking closer. "Wade Harlow, I heard you were dead." "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," Wade said, keeping his hands visible and his voice steady. "Can I come down, or are we going to have this reunion with guns pointed at me?" Frank studied him for a long moment, then gestured. "Come on down, but slowly." Wade dismounted carefully, aware of at least 6 guns trained on him from various positions around the camp. Frank circled him like a predator, looking for weakness or deception. "So where you been, Wade? 5 years is a long time to stay gone." "Here and there," Wade said. "Wyoming, Colorado, Montana territory. Doing odd jobs, staying out of trouble." "Out of trouble?" Frank laughed. "That doesn't sound like the Wade I remember. The Wade I knew didn't give a damn about anything or anyone. What changed?" This was the dangerous moment. Wade needed to sell the lie without overselling it. He shrugged. "Got tired of drifting. Started thinking maybe there was profit to be made in more organized work. Then I heard through the grapevine that Frank Braxton was still operating. Figured I'd see if you needed an extra gun." "Why would I need you?" Frank asked, his voice deceptively casual. "I got plenty of guns." "Because I was good at what I did," Wade said, meeting Frank's eyes directly. "Because I never panicked, never asked questions, and never left a job unfinished. And because 5 years ago, I rode away owing you a debt. Time to pay it back." Oh, it was exactly the right thing to say. Frank respected debt and obligation more than loyalty or friendship. A slow smile spread across his face. "Funny you should show up now," Frank said. "We got a big job coming up, real big. Could use someone with a steady hand." "I'm listening." Frank gestured toward the camp. "Come on, let's have a drink and talk about old times. Then we'll see if you're still as good as you think you are." Wade followed Frank into the camp, acutely aware he was walking into a nest of vipers with no backup and no guarantee he'd walk out alive. Around a campfire sat 4 more men, 2 Wade recognized from the old days, 2 who were new. Frank made introductions, and Wade nodded to each man, reading them quickly. The 2 he knew, Charlie and Tom, looked pleased to see him. The new men, a Mexican named Rodriguez and a young hothead called Jake, regarded him with suspicion. "Wade here used to ride with us," Frank announced, pouring whiskey into tin cups, before he got spooked and ran off like a scared rabbit. "I didn't run," Wade said evenly. "I left because I needed to clear my head. There's a difference." "Is there?" Frank handed him a cup. "To old friends and new opportunities." They drank, and the whiskey burned going down, cheap rotgut that Wade had learned to tolerate during his time with the gang. The men talked, testing Wade with questions and stories, seeing if he'd changed too much to fit back in. Wade played his part carefully, being the man he used to be, quiet but confident, willing to follow orders but not afraid to speak his mind. He laughed at their jokes, contributed his own stories, and slowly felt the men's suspicion ease. But Frank remained watchful, his eyes never leaving Wade's face. As the night deepened and the others grew drunk, Frank pulled Wade aside. "Walk with me." They moved away from the fire, into the darkness beyond the camp. Wade's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Frank seemed relaxed. "Tell me the truth, Wade," Frank said quietly. "Why are you really here?" This was the moment. Wade took a breath and went with instinct. "Because I'm broke, Frank. Because 5 years of drifting and odd jobs hasn't gotten me anywhere. Because I'm tired of being alone with my ghosts, and at least when I rode with you, I felt like I was part of something." It was closer to the truth than any lie could have been, and Frank heard the sincerity in it. He nodded slowly. "The job we're planning is big," he said. "Bank in a little town called Iron Creek. They're expecting a gold shipment from the Virginia City mines, maybe $50,000 worth. We hit it Friday, fast and clean." Wade's stomach clenched, but he kept his voice neutral. "What's the plan?" "You'll find out when we ride out Friday morning," Frank said. "Until then, you're on watch duty with the others. And Wade," his voice turned cold, "if I find out you're playing me, if I even suspect you've turned coat or brought the law sniffing around, I'll gut you myself and leave you for the coyotes. We clear?" "Crystal," Wade said. Frank clapped him on the shoulder, the gesture almost friendly. "Good. Welcome back, Wade. Let's make some money together." As they walked back to the campfire, Wade's mind was already racing. He had less than 3 days to get word to Coleman about the plan, but Frank hadn't given him enough details yet. He'd need to stay close, listen carefully, and wait for an opportunity. The next 2 days were tense. Wade settled back into the rhythm of camp life, standing watch, maintaining weapons, listening to the men talk. Frank laid out more of the plan in pieces, never giving anyone the complete picture, and Wade absorbed every detail. There would be 6 of them hitting the bank. Rodriguez and Jake would handle the horses outside. Charlie and Tom would control the civilians inside. Frank and Wade would handle the vault and any resistance. They'd hit at noon when the bank was busiest, use the crowd as confusion and cover, and be gone before any organized response could form. It was a brutal plan, likely to end with civilians dead if anything went wrong. Wade needed to get word to Coleman soon, but Frank kept him close, rarely leaving him alone for more than a few minutes. Finally, on Thursday evening, Wade's opportunity came. Frank sent him to scout the trail they'd use to approach Iron Creek, checking for any patrols or unexpected obstacles. Wade rode out with his heart pounding, knowing this might be his only chance. He found Coleman's men exactly where they'd agreed to wait, hidden in a ravine 2 miles from the gang's camp. Wade dismounted quickly and relayed everything he'd learned: the plan, the timing, the number of men involved. "Can you stop them before they reach town?" Wade asked urgently. Coleman shook his head. "Too risky. If we try to ambush them on the trail and even one gets away, they'll scatter and we'll never get another chance like this. We need to let them reach town, let them think they're succeeding, and then take them when they're committed to the robbery." "People could die," Wade protested. "People will definitely die if we don't stop Frank permanently," Coleman countered. "This is our best shot. You just need to do one more thing." "What?" "When the shooting starts tomorrow, you make sure Frank doesn't leave that bank alive. He's too dangerous, too smart. If he escapes, he'll just keep killing." Wade's blood ran cold. "You want me to kill him?" "I want you to finish what you started 5 years ago," Coleman said. "You left because you knew what Frank was. Now's your chance to make sure he can't hurt anyone else." Wade rode back to camp with Coleman's words echoing in his mind. He'd never killed a man before, had always managed to avoid crossing that final line. But he thought about Evelyn, about the innocent people of Iron Creek who were just trying to live their lives, about the future he might have if he could just survive the next 24 hours. Sometimes survival meant doing things you never thought you could. That night, Wade barely slept. He thought about Emma and Sarah, about whether they'd be proud or horrified by what he was about to do. He thought about Evelyn waiting at the homestead, trusting him to come back. He thought about the man he used to be and the man he was trying to become. When dawn came cold and gray, the gang prepared to ride. Wade checked his weapons with hands that were steady, despite the fear coiling in his gut. This was it. Everything he'd survived, everything he'd run from, everything he'd built, it all came down to what happened in the next few hours. "You ready?" Frank asked, swinging into his saddle. Wade mounted dust and met Frank's eyes. "Ready as I'll ever be." They rode toward Iron Creek as the sun climbed higher, 6 men heading toward violence and blood, and Wade prayed silently that he'd see another sunset when this was over. Iron Creek appeared on the horizon like a mirage, its weathered buildings shimmering in the midday heat. Wade's mouth was dry despite the water he'd drunk that morning, his heart hammering a rhythm that matched Dust's hoofbeats. Beside him, Frank Braxton rode with the casual confidence of a man who'd done this a dozen times before, his hand resting easily on his gun belt, his eyes scanning the street ahead with predatory focus. The other 4 men spread out slightly as they entered town, trying to look casual despite the tension radiating from each of them. Rodriguez and Jake peeled off toward the hitching post near the bank. Charlie and Tom dismounted at the general store, pretending to examine goods in the window while really watching for any sign of law enforcement. Wade's eyes swept the street, looking for Coleman's men. They had to be here somewhere, hidden and waiting, but Wade couldn't spot a single deputy. Either they were exceptionally well concealed or something had gone terribly wrong. "Easy," Frank murmured beside him, noticing Wade's tension. "Just like old times, in and out, clean and simple." Nothing about this was going to be clean or simple, Wade thought, but he nodded and dismounted when Frank did. His legs felt unsteady beneath him, adrenaline already flooding his system even though the violence hadn't started yet. They walked toward the bank, their boots echoing on the wooden boardwalk. A few townspeople passed by, a woman with a basket, an old man with a cane, 2 children chasing each other down the street. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that everything was about to explode into chaos. Wade thought of Evelyn, 5 miles away at the homestead, and sent up a silent prayer that Deputy Barnes was keeping her safe, that she'd never have to know the details of what was about to happen here. Frank's hand moved to the door handle of the bank. "Remember," he said quietly, "anyone tries to be a hero, we put them down fast. No hesitation." Wade nodded, his throat too tight to speak. His hand moved to his gun, fingers wrapping around the familiar grip. In a few seconds, there would be no turning back. Frank pushed open the door and strode inside. Wade half a step behind him. The bank was crowded. At least a dozen customers waiting in line, the teller cage occupied by a nervous young man, and sitting at a desk in the corner, the bank manager going over papers with an elderly couple. For one frozen moment, everything was normal. People glanced up at their entrance with casual curiosity. The teller started to smile in greeting. Then Frank drew his gun. "Everyone on the floor!" His voice cracked like a whip through the space. "This is a robbery. Anyone moves, anyone screams, anyone tries to be brave, you die!" Chaos erupted. Women screamed, men shouted. Someone knocked over a chair trying to drop to the ground. The elderly woman at the manager's desk started sobbing. The young teller raised his hands, his face going white with terror. Wade drew his own gun, covering the room while his stomach churned with disgust. These weren't outlaws or enemies. They were shopkeepers and farmers, mothers and fathers, people just trying to deposit their earnings or withdraw money for supplies. Charlie and Tom burst through the door behind them, guns drawn, and Frank barked orders. "Charlie, watch the front door. Tom, get everyone's hands where we can see them. Wade, you're with me on the vault." The bank manager, a middle-aged man with wire spectacles, stood shakily, his hands raised. "Please, we don't want any trouble. Just take the money and go." "That's the plan," Frank said coldly. He grabbed the manager by his collar and shoved him toward the vault. "Open it, now." Wade followed them to the back, his gun trained on the manager even as his mind raced. Where was Coleman? Where were the deputies? The plan had been to let the gang get inside, start the robbery, and then spring the trap. But Wade saw no sign of law enforcement anywhere. Had something gone wrong? Had Coleman been delayed? Or worse, had Wade been set up, sent in here to die alongside the gang as punishment for his past crimes? The manager's hand shook so badly he could barely work the combination lock. "Please," he whispered, tears running down his face. "Please don't hurt anyone. We have children in here." Frank pressed his gun against the man's temple. "Then I suggest you open that vault faster." The lock clicked. The vault door swung open, revealing stacks of cash and several locked boxes that likely contained the gold shipment. Frank's eyes gleamed with greed. "Load it up," he ordered Wade, tossing him a canvas bag. "Everything, fast." Wade moved into the vault. his hands working automatically while his mind screamed at him to do something, anything, to stop this nightmare before it spiraled further out of control. He could hear Tom yelling at the customers to stay down, could hear crying and frightened whispers, could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He was loading the second bag when he heard it, the sound of breaking glass from the front of the bank, followed immediately by Frank's furious shout. "It's a trap! Law's outside!" Everything exploded into violence. Gunfire erupted from the street, bullets punching through the bank's windows in a deadly hail. Wade dropped to the floor instinctively as glass rained down around him. Through the chaos, he heard Frank screaming orders, heard return fire from Charlie and Tom, heard the terrified screams of the trapped civilians. Wade scrambled out of the vault on his hands and knees, his gun forgotten as survival instinct took over. The bank manager had collapsed near the desk, clutching his arm where a stray bullet had grazed him. An elderly man was trying to shield his wife with his body. A young mother huddled in the corner, her two children pressed against her chest. "Wade!" Frank's voice cut through the chaos. "Get over here!" Wade looked up and saw Frank crouched behind the teller cage, returning fire through the shattered windows. Charlie was down, blood spreading across his chest, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Tom had taken cover behind an overturned desk, his face white with panic. Wade made a decision. Instead of joining Frank, he crawled toward the civilians, shouting over the gunfire. "Back door! Everyone to the back door now!" The young mother looked at him with terrified, uncomprehending eyes. Wade grabbed her arm, hauled her to her feet, and shoved her toward the back of the bank where he'd spotted a rear exit earlier. "Move! Get your children out!" "Wade, what the hell are you doing?" Frank roared. Wade ignored him, helping the elderly couple to their feet, pushing them toward the back. "Go, all of you, get out now!" More bullets slammed into the bank. Tom cried out as one caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Jake burst through the front door, wild-eyed and bleeding from a cut on his forehead. "Rodriguez is dead! They got him and the horses!" "Then we fight our way out," Frank snarled. He turned to see Wade helping civilians escape and his face twisted with rage. "Wade! You traitorous son of a—" Frank swung his gun toward Wade, but Wade was already moving. He dove behind the teller cage as Frank's shot went wide, plaster exploding from the wall where his head had been a second earlier. "You brought them here!" Frank screamed. "You sold us out!" Wade came up firing, his shot catching Frank in the leg. The outlaw went down with a howl of pain and fury, his gun skittering across the floor. Tom raised his weapon toward Wade, but a bullet from outside caught him in the chest and he collapsed without firing. Jake stood frozen near the door, looking between Wade and Frank, clearly trying to decide whose side he was on. The decision was made for him when Deputy Barnes appeared in the doorway, gun raised. "Drop it!" Barnes shouted. Jake spun and fired wildly. Barnes's return shot was more accurate, catching Jake square in the chest. The young outlaw crashed backwards through the broken window and lay still in the street. Wade used the distraction to make sure the last of the civilians had escaped through the back. The bank was a war zone now, shattered glass everywhere. Bullet holes in every surface, 3 dead men bleeding on the floor, and Frank Braxton dragging himself toward his fallen gun with murder in his eyes. "Frank, don't!" Wade shouted, but he knew it was useless. Frank had never surrendered in his life and wasn't going to start now. Frank's fingers closed around his gun. He rolled, bringing it up toward Wade with the desperation of a dying man determined to take his enemy with him. Wade had no choice. He fired 3 times, the shots echoing in the confined space, each one finding its target. Frank jerked with each impact, his gun falling from nerveless fingers. He stared at Wade with eyes that held betrayal and hatred and a strange kind of respect, all mixed together. His lips moved, forming words Wade couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. Then Frank Braxton died, his blood spreading across the bank floor in a dark pool. Wade stood frozen, his gun still raised, staring at the man he'd just killed. He'd ridden with Frank once, had eaten meals with him, had listened to his stories around campfires, and now Frank was dead by Wade's hand, and Wade felt nothing but a vast, hollow numbness. "Wade!" Coleman's voice cut through his shock. The marshal appeared in the doorway, gun drawn, his eyes sweeping the carnage. "You hit?" Wade looked down at himself, surprised to find no blood. "No, I'm fine." "The civilians?" "Out the back, safe, I think. The bank manager took a graze to the arm, but everyone else made it out. Coleman moved through the bank, checking bodies, securing weapons. Barnes and 2 other deputies entered cautiously, their faces grim as they surveyed the destruction. "Charlie Weston, dead," Coleman announced, checking the first body. "Tom Baker, dead. Jake Morrison, dead outside. Rodriguez Garcia, dead by the horses." He looked down at Frank's body. "Frank Braxton, dead." His eyes met Wade's. "You did good, Harlow. You saved those people." Wade's hand started shaking. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him cold and sick. "I killed him he said, his voice sounding strange and distant. "I killed Frank." "You did what needed doing," Coleman said firmly. He holstered his gun and moved closer. "Listen to me, Wade. What happened here today? It was ugly and violent, and people died. But those civilians are alive because of you. That young mother and her children, that elderly couple, they're going home tonight because you chose to protect them instead of helping the gang escape." "I was one of them," Wade whispered. 5 years ago, I rode with these men. I could have ended up like them." "But you didn't," Coleman insisted. "You left, you changed, you became something better. And today you proved it. You made the right choice when it mattered most." Barnes approached, his young face pale but determined. "Marshal, we need to get statements from the witnesses, and we should send word to the homestead that Wade's safe. Miss Cross is probably worried sick." "Evelyn." Wade's heart lurched. She'd been 5 miles away during all of this, not knowing if he was alive or dead, waiting and worrying with no way to help. He needed to see her, needed to prove to himself that something good and clean still existed in the world after the violence and blood. "I need to go to her," Wade said. "Go," Coleman interrupted. "We'll handle things here. Take your horse and go. I'll send Barnes out tomorrow to get your official statement. But Wade," the marshal's expression softened slightly. "Take some time before you talk to her. Get cleaned up. Process what happened. That woman cares about you, and you don't want her seeing you like this." Wade looked down and realized his hands were still shaking. His shirt was spattered with blood, Frank's blood, and he probably looked as shell-shocked as he felt. Coleman was right. He needed to pull himself together before he faced Evelyn. "There's a creek about a mile north of town," Coleman said. "Clean up there. Take however long you need. We'll be here when you're ready." Wade nodded numbly and walked out of the bank on legs that felt disconnected from his body. The street was crowded now, townspeople emerging from cover, pointing at the bodies, whispering among themselves. Wade saw the young mother he'd helped escape. Her children clutched against her. She met his eyes and mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." Wade couldn't respond. He just kept walking until he reached Dust, who'd somehow survived the chaos unscathed. He mounted and rode out of Iron Creek without looking back, Coleman's directions echoing in his mind. The creek was exactly where the marshal said it would be, a clear stream cutting through a stand of cottonwood trees. Wade dismounted and stood at the water's edge, staring at his reflection. He barely recognized the man looking back, haunted eyes, blood-spattered shirt, hands that had taken a life. He stripped off his shirt and knelt by the water, scrubbing at his hands and arms with sand and creek water, watching Frank's blood swirl away downstream. He scrubbed until his skin was raw, but the stain felt like it went deeper than any amount of washing could reach. Wade had killed a man today. He'd looked Frank Braxton in the eyes and pulled the trigger 3 times, ending a life with cold efficiency. The fact that it was justified, that Frank had been trying to kill him, that it had saved innocent people, none of that changed the fundamental truth that Wade had crossed a line he could never uncross. He thought about Emma and Sarah, about whether they'd understand why he'd done it. He thought about the 2 years he'd spent after their deaths, drowning in grief and guilt and rage. He'd been so close to becoming Frank, to letting violence and bitterness consume him completely. But he'd pulled back. He'd walked away. And today, when faced with the choice between his past and his future, he'd chosen to save lives instead of take them. It didn't make the killing easier, but maybe it made it bearable. Wade sat by the creek for over an hour, letting the Montana sun warm his skin, watching clouds drift across the enormous sky. Slowly, the shaking stopped. Slowly, his heart rate returned to normal. Slowly, he began to feel like himself again, or at least like some new version of himself that could live with what he'd done. Finally, when the sun was starting its descent toward the mountains, Wade pulled on his spare shirt from his saddlebag, mounted Dust, and turned toward Evelyn's homestead. The ride seemed to take forever and no time at all. With each mile, Wade's anticipation grew, the need to see her, to hold her, to prove to himself that beauty and goodness still existed after the ugliness of what he'd survived. But he was also terrified of what she'd see when she looked at him now. Would she see the man who'd helped repair her cabin and made her laugh? Or would she see a killer with blood on his hands? The homestead came into view as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Wade saw Deputy Barnes first, standing guard near the barn, and the young man's face split into a relieved grin when he spotted Wade approaching. "Thank God," Barnes called out. "Marshall sent word by Ryder about an hour ago that you were safe, but Miss Cross has been pacing like a caged mountain lion ever since. Go on, she's inside." Wade dismounted and walked toward the cabin on legs that felt uncertain again. The door opened before he could knock, and there she was. Evelyn, her dark hair escaping its bun, her dress dusty from work, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. For a moment they just stared at each other across the threshold. Then Evelyn made a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh and threw herself into his arms. Wade caught her, holding her tight against his chest, his face buried in her hair. She was shaking, or maybe he was shaking, or maybe they both were. Her hands clutched at his back, his shoulders, his shirt, as if trying to convince herself he was real. "I thought you were dead," she whispered against his neck. "When the writer came and said there'd been shooting at the bank, that men had died, I thought," her voice broke, "I thought I'd lost you." "I'm here," Wade said roughly, his arms tightening around her. "I'm safe. It's over." Evelyn pulled back enough to look at his face, her hands coming up to cup his cheeks. Her eyes searched his desperately, and Wade wondered what she saw there, what marks the violence had left on him that couldn't be washed away in any creek. "Did you—" She paused, seeming to struggle with the question. "Did you have to—" "Yes," Wade said quietly, answering the question she couldn't finish. "Frank tried to kill me. I didn't have a choice." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her thumbs stroking his cheekbones gently. "I'm sorry you had to do that. I'm sorry you had to face that alone." "I wasn't alone," Wade said. "Coleman and his men were there. And more than that—" He covered her hands with his own. "I was carrying you with me, Evelyn. Every moment in that bank, every decision I made, I was thinking about getting back here, getting back to you." "Wade," she breathed and pulled his face down to kiss him. This kiss was different from their first, less tentative, more desperate, flavored with relief and fear and the bone-deep need to affirm they were both alive. Wade kissed her back with everything he had, pouring all his fear and gratitude and growing love into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Evelyn said firmly, "Come inside. You need food and rest and someone to help you process whatever happened today." Wade let her lead him into the cabin, let her settle him in the chair by the fire, let her bring him water and bread and cheese, even though he wasn't sure he could eat. Deputy Barnes had tactfully retreated to the barn, leaving them alone. As the sun set and the cabin filled with firelight and shadows, Wade told Evelyn everything, about infiltrating the gang, about the robbery, about the shootout and Frank's death. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her hand finding his and holding tight. "The civilians all made it out," Wade finished. "The bank manager took a minor wound, but everyone else was unharmed. Coleman said I saved them." "You did," Evelyn said firmly. "Wade, you could have helped the gang escape. You could have chosen your own survival over theirs, but you didn't. You protected innocent people at great risk to yourself. That's not something a bad man does." "I killed someone, Evelyn. I took a life." "You stopped a killer," she corrected gently. "There's a difference. Frank Braxton made his choices long ago, and those choices led him to that bank today. What happened to him was a consequence of the life he chose to live. You didn't murder him. You stopped him from murdering others." Wade wanted to believe her, wanted to accept the absolution in her words, but the weight of what he'd done still pressed heavy on his chest. "I'm not the same man who left here 3 days ago," he said quietly. I've changed, Evelyn. I've crossed lines I can't uncross. Evelyn shifted her chair closer, her knee pressing against his. Then we'll figure out who you are now, together, just like we've been doing all along. Wade, did you think I believed you were perfect? Did you think I didn't know you carried darkness in you? I thought maybe I could leave it behind, Wade admitted. I thought maybe with you, I could just be someone new. You can't leave your past behind, Evelyn said. It's part of you, part of what shaped you. But that doesn't mean it has to define you. What happened today, what you did, that's part of your story now. Not a shameful secret to hide, but a choice you made that saved lives. You can carry that with honor, Wade. Wade looked at her in the firelight, this remarkable woman who'd lost everything and rebuilt herself into something fierce and brave, and felt something in his chest loosen. She wasn't rejecting him for what he'd done. She was accepting all of him, past, present, darkness, and light. I don't deserve you, he said. Probably not, Evelyn agreed with a slight smile. But you're stuck with me anyway. Her expression grew more serious. Wade, Marshal Coleman promised that helping him would clear your record. Does that mean... She paused, then continued carefully. Does that mean you're free now? Free to go wherever you want without fear of arrest? Wade nodded slowly. Coleman gave me his word. My past with the Braxton gang is forgiven. I'm a free man. Then what are you going to do? Evelyn's voice was carefully neutral, but Wade heard the fear underneath. Where will you go? This was the moment. Wade could leave now, ride out tomorrow, with a clear conscience and a clean slate, go anywhere he wanted, be anyone he wanted. He'd fulfilled his promise to stay until the cabin was fixed. He'd helped Evelyn get established. He'd done more than he'd ever agreed to do. He could leave, just like he'd always left before. But looking at Evelyn's face in the firelight, seeing the barely concealed hope and fear in her eyes, Wade realized something fundamental had changed. He didn't want to leave. He didn't want to keep drifting, keep running, keep choosing the safety of solitude over the risk of connection. He wanted to stay. I don't know, Wade said honestly. I spent 8 years running because I was afraid of losing people I cared about. And then I met you, and you made me want to stop running. But today, his voice roughened. Today I killed a man, Evelyn. I learned that I'm capable of violence when pushed. What if I'm too broken? What if I can't be the kind of man you deserve? Evelyn leaned forward, her hands gripping his face firmly. Listen to me, Wade Harlow. You are not broken. You are scarred, yes. You've been through terrible things and done difficult things. But broken men don't spend weeks helping a stranger rebuild a cabin. Broken men don't risk their lives to save civilians. Broken men don't worry about whether they're good enough. She paused, her eyes fierce and bright. You're not broken. You're healing. And if you'll let me, I'd like to help you finish that healing. How? Wade asked, his voice barely audible. By building a life together, Evelyn said simply. By proving every day that the past doesn't have to dictate the future. By choosing each other, over and over, until it becomes as natural as breathing. She pulled back slightly. But only if that's what you want. I won't trap you here, Wade. If you need to leave, if you need to keep moving, I'll understand. I'll be sad, but I'll understand. Wade thought about all the towns he'd passed through, all the temporary jobs and temporary rooms and temporary connections. He thought about the emptiness of always moving, never belonging, never letting anyone close enough to matter. And then he thought about this cabin they'd repaired together, about watching sunsets from the porch and working side by side in comfortable silence. He thought about Evelyn's laugh and her courage and the way she saw good in him even when he couldn't see it himself. He thought about the possibility of home. I want to stay, Wade said, and felt the truth of it resonate in his bones. I want to build a life here with you. I want to stop running and start living. I'm terrified of it, and I'll probably mess it up, but... He took her hands in his. But if you'll have me, Evelyn Cross, I'd like to try. Evelyn's face transformed with joy, tears spilling down her cheeks even as she smiled. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Wade. Stay. Build a life with me. We'll mess it up together. Wade pulled her close and kissed her, tasting salt from her tears and feeling something fundamental shift in his world. For 8 years, he'd been a man without a home, without roots, without a future beyond the next town and the next job. But sitting in this rough cabin with this remarkable woman in his arms, Wade Harlow finally understood what he'd been searching for all along. Not a place, not even a person, exactly, but a sense of belonging, of purpose, of building something that mattered with someone who mattered. He'd found his home, and this time he wasn't going to run from it. They spent that night talking until the fire burned down to embers, and the Montana sky blazed with more stars than seemed possible. Wade told Evelyn things he'd never told anyone, about the guilt he carried over his family's deaths, about the years of drifting that had felt more like drowning, about the moment he'd seen her standing up to those men in Iron Creek, and felt something long dormant stir in his chest. Evelyn shared her own fears and dreams, talking about the loneliness of losing everyone she loved, about the terror and exhilaration of traveling west alone, about how she'd been so focused on survival that she'd forgotten to imagine what living might actually look like. "Until you showed up," she said softly, her head resting against his shoulder as they sat together on the bench he'd built. "And suddenly I could see it, a real life, not just existence, a partner, not just hired help, a future that looked like something worth fighting for." Wade pressed a kiss to her hair, breathing in the scent of lavender and wood smoke that would forever mean home to him now. "I'm still scared," he admitted. "Scared I'll wake up, and you'll realize you made a mistake. Scared something will happen to you like it happened to Emma and Sarah. Scared I'll fail you somehow." "Fear is just proof you care about something," Evelyn said. "And caring is what makes life worth living, even when it's scary." She lifted her head to look at him. "We'll be scared together, Wade, but we'll also be brave together. That's what partnership means." When Wade finally retreated to the barn that night, it was with a lightness in his chest he hadn't felt in 8 years. Deputy Barnes, who was bedded down in the corner, raised an eyebrow at Wade's expression, but wisely said nothing. "Marshall's coming out tomorrow," Barnes said instead, "to get your official statement and deliver the paperwork clearing your record. Also said something about reward money. The bank in Iron Creek is offering compensation to anyone who helped stop the robbery." Wade hadn't even thought about money, but he supposed it would be useful. The homestead needed supplies, and winter was coming. If he was really staying, really building a life here, he'd need to think about practical matters like income and sustainability. The thought should have felt like a trap, like walls closing in. Instead, it felt like possibility. Morning came with a brilliant sunrise that painted the prairie gold and crimson. Wade was up before dawn, checking on dust and surveying the homestead with new eyes. He'd spent weeks repairing this place as a temporary job, but now he was looking at it as home, seeing not just what was fixed, but what could still be built. The cabin was sound now, weatherproof and warm, but they could add a proper bedroom, maybe a small parlor. The garden was cleared but needed expansion if they were going to grow enough food to get through winter. The barn could house more than just dust. They could get chickens, maybe a milk cow, eventually some cattle. Wade found himself mentally cataloging projects and improvements, his mind already planning for seasons and years ahead instead of just days and weeks. It was a strange feeling, thinking in terms of permanence, but not an unwelcome one. Evelyn emerged from the cabin as the sun cleared the horizon, her hair loose around her shoulders and her face still soft with sleep. She smiled when she saw him, and Wade felt his heart do that uncomfortable flip that was becoming familiar. "Morning," she said, walking over to slip her hand into his. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," Wade admitted. "Too much thinking." "Good thinking or bad thinking?" "Future thinking," Wade said. "About what we could build here, what we could make of this place." Evelyn squeezed his hand. "Tell me." So Wade did, describing his ideas for expanding the homestead, improving the land, creating something that could sustain them through harsh Montana winters and provide a real living. Evelyn listened with growing excitement, adding her own suggestions, and before long they were talking over each other with plans and possibilities. They were still deep in conversation when Marshal Coleman rode up with 2 deputies mid-morning. Wade felt his stomach tighten with old instinct. Lawmen meant trouble, meant running, meant looking over your shoulder. But Coleman's expression was neutral as he dismounted, and Wade forced himself to stay calm. "Mr. Harlow, Miss Cross," Coleman greeted them. Hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Evelyn said graciously. Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot. That would be welcome, thank you. They settled around the rough table inside the cabin, the deputies remaining outside with Barnes. Coleman accepted the coffee Evelyn offered and took a long sip before pulling papers from his jacket. First things first, the marshal said, laying documents on the table. Your official pardon signed by the territorial governor himself. All charges related to your association with the Braxton gang are cleared. You're a free man, Mr. Harlow, with no warrants or legal troubles hanging over you. Wade stared at the papers, seeing official seals and signatures that represented something he'd thought impossible. A clean slate, a fresh start, a future without constantly looking over his shoulder. His hand shook slightly as he picked up the document. Thank you, he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite contain. You earned it, Coleman replied. What you did took real courage. The civilians you saved, they're talking all over town about the stranger who protected them when he could have just robbed them blind. You're a hero to those people. Wade shifted uncomfortably. I'm no hero. I just did what needed doing. That's exactly what heroes do, Coleman said. But there's more. The bank is offering a reward of $500 for your role in stopping the robbery and recovering the money. The town council added another $200 as thanks. That's $700, Mr. Harlow, enough to set yourself up pretty well if you're planning to stay in these parts. Wade's eyes widened. $700 was more money than he'd seen in years, enough to properly outfit the homestead and see them through winter with supplies to spare. Beside him, he felt Evelyn stiffen with surprise. That's incredibly generous, Wade managed. Coleman pulled a bank draft from his pocket and slid it across the table. There's also this. Frank Braxton had a $500 bounty on his head, dead or alive. Technically, you killed him in self-defense during a lawful action, which means the bounty is yours if you want to claim it. Wade stared at the draft, feeling sick. Blood money. Payment for taking a life, even a life that needed taking. Part of him wanted to refuse it on principle, but the practical part, the part that was thinking about Evelyn's future now, about providing and protecting, knew they could use it. I'll take it, Wade said quietly, but I'm donating half to the families of anyone who was hurt or traumatized in the robbery. The rest goes toward improving this homestead and making a life here. Coleman nodded approvingly. That's a good choice. Shows character. He gathered the remaining papers. There's one more thing. Given your skills and the courage you showed, I'm authorized to offer you a position as a deputy marshal if you're interested. The territory needs good men who can handle themselves in difficult situations. Wade's immediate instinct was to refuse. He'd spent 8 years avoiding any kind of official position, anything that tied him down or made him responsible for others. But then he looked at Evelyn, saw the careful neutrality in her expression that meant she was leaving this decision entirely to him, and thought about what kind of life he wanted to build. I appreciate the offer, Marshal, Wade said slowly, but I think I'm done with violence and gunfights. I'd rather spend my energy building something than enforcing something, if that makes sense. It does, Coleman said, standing and extending his hand. The offer stands if you change your mind. In the meantime, you've got the gratitude of everyone in Iron Creek and the territory. That's worth something, too. After Coleman and his deputies left, Wade sat at the table staring at the bank draft and the pardon papers, trying to process how completely his life had changed in the span of a week. He'd come to Montana as a drifter with no future, and now he had money, freedom, and most importantly, someone to share it all with. $700, Evelyn said softly, breaking the silence. Plus 500 more. That's more than my uncle ever saw in his whole time here. Wade, we could do so much with that money. We could, Wade agreed. He looked up at her, seeing dreams and possibilities reflected in her eyes. What do you want, Evelyn? Really want? If we could build anything here, what would it look like? Evelyn sat down beside him, her expression thoughtful. I want a real home, she said finally. Not just a cabin, but a homestead that can support us year-round. Enough land under cultivation to grow our own food and sell produce in town. Animals, chickens for eggs, a cow for milk, maybe some pigs. I want to know that when winter comes, we'll have enough stored up to survive it comfortably. That's practical, Wade said. What else? I want Evelyn paused, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. I want a family someday. Children growing up here, learning the land, having the kind of freedom I never had in Philadelphia. I want to build something that lasts beyond just us. Wade's chest tightened with a mixture of fear and longing. The thought of children terrified him after losing Sarah, but it also represented hope, the possibility of joy and love, and a future that stretched beyond just survival. I want that too, he said quietly. All of it. It scares me, but I want it. Evelyn leaned over and kissed him softly. Then let's build it together. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity and planning. Wade rode into Iron Creek with Evelyn and used part of the reward money to buy supplies they'd need: lumber for expanding the cabin, seeds for a larger garden, chickens, and a pregnant cow that would give them a calf by spring. He purchased proper tools, a good stove to replace the open fireplace, glass windows for the addition they were planning. The townspeople greeted him with respect and gratitude wherever he went. The young mother whose children he'd saved stopped him on the street to thank him again, tears in her eyes. The bank manager, his arm in a sling, insisted on buying Wade a drink at the saloon and toasting his health. Mr. Chen pulled Wade aside at the general store and said quietly, "You've made a home here, Mr. Harlow. That's not easy for a man like you, I think. But you've done it. Miss Cross is lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one," Wade replied, and meant it. Not everything was smooth. 3 weeks after the robbery, Ben Harker rode up to the homestead with his 2 remaining men. Wade's hand moved to his gun instinctively, but Harker raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here for trouble," Harker called from a safe distance. "Just wanted to say my piece and be done with it." Wade walked forward slowly, aware of Evelyn behind him with her rifle ready. "Then say it and move on." Harker's face was hard, but there was a grudging respect in his eyes. "Heard what you did in town. Heard how you stood up to the Braxton gang and saved a bunch of people who couldn't save themselves. That took guts." He paused. "And I heard you're staying for good, building a life here with Miss Cross." "That's right," Wade said evenly. "And if you're here to cause problems about her land—" "I'm not," Harker interrupted. "I came to say I was wrong. About you, about her, about this whole situation. Miss Cross has as much right to this land as anyone, and she's proven she can work it and defend it. And you—" He met Wade's eyes directly. "You've proven you're not just some drifter looking for easy work. You're a man who stands by his commitments. I respect that." Wade studied Harker, looking for deception or hidden threat, but found only grudging honesty. "So we're done here? No more threats? No more harassment?" "We're done," Harker confirmed. "You've got my word. Miss Cross keeps her land, you build your life, and I'll leave you both in peace." He touched his hat brim in a gesture that might have been respect. "Good luck to you both." Harker and his men rode away, and Wade felt another weight lift from his shoulders. Evelyn came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. "Did that really just happen?" she asked, sounding bemused. "Did Ben Harker just apologize and leave us alone?" "Appears so," Wade said. "I think word getting around about the robbery changed how people see us. Hard to harass a woman when her man's the local hero, I guess." "Her man," Evelyn repeated, a smile tugging at her lips. "I like the sound of that." Wade turned to face her fully. "Is that what I am? Your man?" "Well," Evelyn said, her eyes sparkling with mischief and affection, "you're living on my land, eating my food, sleeping in my barn, and spending every waking hour either working with me or talking with me. If that doesn't make you my man, I don't know what does." "Sleeping in the barn seems like a technicality we should address," Wade said, his heart hammering nervously despite the lightness in his voice. "Evelyn, I know we've only known each other a few months, and I know there's all sorts of proper courting rituals we're supposed to follow. But I'm not much for propriety, and I don't want to waste time on formalities when I already know what I want." Evelyn's breath caught. "What do you want, Wade?" Wade took both her hands in his, grounding himself in the connection between them. "I want to marry you, Evelyn Cross. I want to build this homestead into a real ranch with you. I want to wake up beside you every morning and work beside you every day. I want to plant gardens and raise children and grow old watching Montana sunsets from the porch we built together." He paused, his voice dropping to something raw and honest. I want to stop running and start living, and I want to do it all with you. Will you marry me? Tears spilled down Evelyn's cheeks. Even as she smiled so broadly it seemed her face might split. Yes, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Yes, Wade Harlow, I'll marry you. I'll build a life with you and face every challenge beside you and love you for however many years God gives us. Wade pulled her close and kissed her with all the love and gratitude and hope surging through his chest. This woman had saved him just as surely as he'd saved those civilians in the bank, not from bullets, but from the slow death of loneliness and grief. When they broke apart, both laughing and crying, Evelyn said, "We should go to town tomorrow and find Reverend Michaels. I don't want to wait any longer than necessary." "Neither do I," Wade agreed. "But Evelyn, there's something you should know. I don't have much to offer beyond hard work and my word. No family to bring to this marriage, no inheritance, no grand future beyond what we build ourselves." "That's everything I want," Evelyn said firmly. "I've had wealth before and lost it. I've had family and lost them too. What I want now is a partner who won't quit when things get hard, who'll stand beside me through whatever comes. That's you, Wade. That's more valuable than any inheritance." They rode into Iron Creek the next morning and found Reverend Michaels at the small church on the edge of town. The preacher's face lit up when they explained their purpose. "I remember you both," he said warmly. "Shared dinner at Mrs. Talbot's boarding house months ago. I'm delighted to hear you found happiness together." He consulted his schedule. "I could perform the ceremony Sunday after regular services, if that suits you. Give folks time to hear the news and attend if they want to celebrate with you." Wade looked at Evelyn, expecting her to agree to the delay. Instead, she shook her head. "With respect, Reverend, we'd like to marry today. Now, if possible. We've both waited long enough for happiness, and we see no reason to postpone it for appearances." Reverend Michaels looked surprised, but not disapproving. "That's unconventional. You'll want witnesses at least, and perhaps—" "I'll stand witness," Mr. Chen's voice came from the church doorway. The shopkeeper entered with a smile. "I saw you both ride in and suspected what you were planning. I'd be honored to witness your union." "As would I," Mrs. Talbot added, appearing behind Mr. Chen. "Lord knows you two have earned some happiness after everything you've been through." So they were married there in the small church, with late morning light streaming through the windows and two unlikely witnesses beaming at them. Wade spoke his vows in a voice that shook with emotion, promising to love and cherish Evelyn for all his days, to stand beside her through hardship and joy, to build a life worthy of the gift she was giving him. Evelyn's vows were equally powerful, her voice steady and sure, as she promised to love Wade in his strength and his vulnerability, to be his partner and his home, to choose him every day for the rest of her life. When Reverend Michaels pronounced them husband and wife, Wade kissed his bride with a heart so full it seemed impossible to contain. This woman who'd been a stranger just months ago was now his wife, his partner, his future. After the ceremony, Mr. Chen insisted on hosting a small celebration at his store, where several townspeople who'd heard the news gathered to offer congratulations. The young mother whose children Wade had saved brought a cake she'd baked. The bank manager offered a toast to the bravest man in Montana Territory. Even the saloon keeper contributed a bottle of good whiskey to mark the occasion. Wade stood with Evelyn's hand in his, accepting congratulations and good wishes, and felt overwhelmed by the sense of community forming around them. These people weren't just customers or acquaintances, they were becoming neighbors, friends, the foundation of a life rooted in place rather than movement. As the sun began to set, Wade and Evelyn finally escaped the celebration and rode back to their homestead, their home now, shared and permanent. Deputy Barnes had long since returned to his regular duties, leaving them truly alone for the first time as husband and wife. Wade carried Evelyn over the threshold of the cabin, making her laugh with the formal gesture. Inside, the space was warm and welcoming, filled with small touches they'd added together. Her books on the shelf he'd built, his tools organized near the door, wildflowers in a jar on the table. "So this is married life," Evelyn said, her arms around Wade's neck as he set her down gently. "Feels remarkably like what we've been doing already." "Except now it's official," Wade said. "And I don't have to sleep in the barn anymore." Evelyn laughed, the sound filling the cabin with joy. "That is a significant improvement." Her expression grew more serious, her hand coming up to cup his face. Wade, are you happy? Really? Truly happy? Wade thought about the question, examining his feelings honestly. Fear was still there. He suspected it always would be, the fear of loss that came from loving someone deeply. But underneath the fear was something stronger: contentment, purpose, hope. Yes, he said simply. For the first time in 8 years, I'm happy. Not just surviving or getting by, but actually happy. You did that, Evelyn. You made me believe in living again. We did that, Evelyn corrected gently. Together. You gave me courage to stand my ground when I wanted to quit. You showed me that I didn't have to face everything alone. We saved each other, Wade. That's what love is. They spent their first night as husband and wife talking and dreaming until exhaustion finally claimed them. Wade fell asleep with Evelyn in his arms, her head resting over his heart. And for the first night in years, he didn't dream about fire or loss or the faces of people he'd failed. Instead, he dreamed about the future, about children laughing in an expanded cabin, about gardens flourishing under the Montana sun, about growing old with the woman beside him, about a life built on love and hard work and the simple courage to keep choosing each other every day. The weeks that followed their wedding fell into a comfortable rhythm. They worked together every day, expanding the homestead and preparing for winter. Wade built a proper addition to the cabin with a separate bedroom and a small parlor where Evelyn could read by lamplight. They dug a new well, repaired all the fencing, and created a chicken coop that actually kept the birds safe from predators. Evelyn threw herself into the garden, planting late-season crops and preserving everything they could for winter stores. She taught Wade how to can vegetables and fruits, and they spent evenings working side by side, preparing for the harsh months ahead. But it wasn't all work. They also learned to rest together, to find joy in small moments. Sunday mornings they'd sleep late and make leisurely breakfast together. Wednesday evenings, Wade would take Evelyn riding across the prairie, exploring their land and the country beyond. Saturday nights, they'd sometimes ride into Iron Creek for dinner at Mrs. Talbot's or drinks at the saloon, slowly building connections with the community they'd chosen. Word spread about the former drifter and the Eastern woman who'd built a life together against all odds. Other homesteaders began stopping by seeking Wade's advice on repairs or Evelyn's knowledge of gardening. They were becoming the kind of people others turned to for help, stable, reliable, rooted. One evening in early October, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset in a blaze of autumn color, Evelyn said quietly, "Wade, I have something to tell you." Something in her tone made Wade's heart skip. He turned to face her, trying to read her expression in the fading light. "What is it?" Evelyn took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby. Come spring, you're going to be a father." Wade's breath left him in a rush. A baby. A child. The fear hit immediately. Memories of Sarah. Thoughts of all the ways he could fail. The terror of loving someone so small and fragile and dependent. But beneath the fear was something else. Wonder, joy, the sense that life was continuing, that love was creating something new and precious. "Are you all right?" Evelyn asked, her voice uncertain. "I know this is complicated for you after—" Wade pulled her close, cutting off her words with a kiss. "I'm terrified," he admitted when they broke apart. "I'm scared I won't be a good father, that I'll fail somehow, that something will happen like it happened before." "I'm scared too," Evelyn said. "But Wade, we face our fears together, remember? That's what we promised. And this child," she placed her hand over his on her stomach, "this child is proof that life goes on, that love creates new possibilities, that we get to write our own story instead of being trapped by the past." Wade nodded, blinking back tears. "A baby," he said, his voice full of awe. "Our baby. Evelyn, He stopped, overwhelmed by emotion. "I know," she said softly. "I love you too." They sat together as darkness fell, talking about the future in concrete terms now, preparing a nursery, saving money for a doctor when the time came, dreaming about who their child might become. Wade felt his fear slowly transforming into determination. He would protect this child, this family. He would be the father he'd never gotten to fully be for Sarah. He would build a life so strong and stable that his children would never doubt they were loved and safe. Winter came to Montana with predictable ferocity, but Wade and Evelyn were ready. They'd stored enough food to feed themselves and their animals comfortably. The cabin was weatherproof and warm, with the new stove Wade had installed keeping the interior cozy even when snow piled high outside. During the long winter evenings, they worked on projects for the baby. Evelyn sewing tiny clothes and blankets while Wade carved a cradle from pine wood he'd saved for the purpose. They talked about names and made plans for expanding their home and dreamed about the child who would arrive with the spring thaw. On Christmas Eve, snow falling soft and steady outside, Wade gave Evelyn his gift, a wooden sign he'd carved and painted with careful precision. It read, "Cross Harlow Ranch, Estent 1878, built on love and courage." Evelyn cried when she saw it, touching the letters reverently. "It's perfect," she whispered. "It's us." "That's who we are now," Wade said. "Not a drifter and an Eastern woman alone. A family, a partnership, a home." Evelyn's gift to Wade was a journal, the first pages already filled with her careful handwriting. "I've been writing down our story," she explained. "How we met, how we fell in love, how we built this life. So our children will know where they came from, what we overcame to be together." Wade read the first pages, his throat tight with emotion as he saw their journey laid out in Evelyn's elegant script. She'd captured everything: the broken wagon, the first kiss, the danger and fear, the triumph and joy. It was their history, their truth, their legacy. "Thank you," he said, pulling her close. "For this, for everything, for choosing me." "Always," Evelyn promised, and kissed him as snow fell outside and the fire crackled warm inside their home. Spring came eventually, as it always did, melting the snow and bringing new green life to the prairie. Evelyn's pregnancy advanced, her belly growing round and obvious, her movements becoming slower and more careful. Wade hovered protectively, trying not to be overbearing, but unable to help his concern. On a warm April morning, as Wade was repairing fence posts near the creek, he heard Evelyn's call. He dropped his tools and ran back to the cabin to find her standing in the doorway, her face calm but her hand pressed to her lower back. "It's time," she said simply. The next 12 hours were the longest of Wade's life. He rode to town and brought back the midwife Mrs. Talbot had recommended, a capable woman named Sarah. The name made Wade's heart clench, but he took it as a good omen. He boiled water and fetched supplies and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. When his daughter's first cry split the air, Wade felt something in his chest break open, not with grief this time, but with overwhelming love and gratitude. The midwife brought her to him, this tiny, perfect being with dark hair like her mother and a face that seemed to hold infinite possibility. "You have a daughter, Mr. Harlow," the midwife said with a smile, "healthy and strong, just like her mama." Wade cradled his daughter carefully, this precious life he'd helped create, and felt tears streaming down his face unchecked. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I'm your papa. I'm going to keep you safe and loved for your whole life, I promise." Evelyn, exhausted but radiant, reached for the baby. "Let me see her, Wade." Wade placed their daughter in Evelyn's arms and sat beside them on the bed, his family complete and whole and more valuable than anything else in the world. "What should we name her?" Evelyn asked, stroking the baby's soft cheek. Wade thought about Sarah, about Emma, about the family he'd lost and the family he'd found. What about Grace, for the grace that brought us together and gave us this second chance? Evelyn smiled through happy tears. "Grace Cross Harlow. It's perfect. She's perfect." "You're perfect," Wade said, kissing his wife's forehead. "Thank you for this gift. Thank you for loving me enough to let me try again." "Thank you for being brave enough to stay," Evelyn replied, "for choosing love over fear." As spring turned to summer, Wade and Evelyn settled into life as parents. Grace was a good baby, sleeping relatively well and nursing eagerly, growing stronger every day. Wade found himself transformed by fatherhood in ways he hadn't expected, more patient, more present, more willing to be vulnerable. He'd catch himself staring at Grace while she slept, marveling that something so perfect could exist, that he'd been given another chance at this joy he thought was lost forever. The fear was still there, probably always would be, but it was balanced now by love so powerful it made the fear seem manageable. One evening in late June, as they sat on the porch, with Grace sleeping peacefully in her cradle between them, Evelyn said, "Do you ever think about how different life could have been? If you hadn't stopped that day in Iron Creek? If you'd kept riding like you planned?" Wade considered the question, looking out at the land they'd built together, thinking about all the moments that had led them here. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I can't imagine it anymore, being that man who rode through towns without stopping. Can't imagine life without you and Grace." "You were looking for home all those years," Evelyn said softly. "You just didn't know what it looked like until you found it." Wade reached over and took her hand, this woman who'd changed everything, who'd made him believe in second chances and new beginnings. "Home isn't a place," he said. "It's you. It's Grace. It's this life we built from nothing but courage and stubbornness. And love," Evelyn added. "Don't forget love." "And love," Wade agreed, raising her hand to his lips. "Always love." As the sun set over the Montana prairie, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Wade Harlow felt something he'd never expected to feel again. Peace. Complete, bone-deep peace that came from knowing exactly where he belonged and who he belonged with. He'd started this journey as a man running from his past, haunted by loss, afraid to let anyone close enough to matter. He'd been convinced that safety lay in solitude, that caring meant vulnerability, that love inevitably led to pain. But Evelyn had taught him different. She'd shown him that courage meant facing fear, not avoiding it, that love was worth the risk of loss, that home wasn't something you found but something you built, day by day, choice by choice, with someone brave enough to build it alongside you. The Cross Harlow Ranch grew over the following years. They expanded their land, added more animals, planted more crops. Other homesteaders settled nearby, drawn by word of the couple who'd made the harsh Montana territory bloom. A small community formed with Wade and Evelyn at its center, not as leaders exactly, but as examples of what was possible when people refused to quit. They had more children, 2 sons who inherited Wade's quiet strength and Evelyn's fierce determination. The cabin expanded again and again until it was a proper ranch house with multiple bedrooms and a real parlor where neighbors gathered for Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. Wade taught his children to ride and rope and build with their hands. Evelyn taught them to read and think and stand up for what was right. Together, they taught them that family wasn't just blood but choice, that home was where you were loved and known, that courage meant facing your fears rather than running from them. Sometimes, sitting on the porch Wade had built more than a decade earlier, watching his children play in the yard while Evelyn hummed in the kitchen, Wade would think about the man he'd been when he first rode into Iron Creek. That haunted drifter who trusted nothing but his horse, and the open trail seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. But he was grateful to that man, in a way. Grateful for all the miles traveled and lessons learned, for the grief endured and the strength forged in fire. Because all of it, every mistake, every loss, every moment of pain, had led him here, to this life, to this family, to this home. Wade Harlow had spent 8 years running from his past. But in the end, he'd found something worth running toward instead. A fearless frontier woman who saw his worth when he couldn't see it himself, who stood beside him through danger and doubt, who loved him not despite his scars, but because of the man those scars had shaped him into. He'd found his match, his partner, his home. And he'd never stopped being grateful for the day his wandering finally ended and his living truly began. The Montana sun set one more time over the Cross Harlow Ranch, painting the prairie in shades of amber and rose. Inside the house, children laughed and a woman sang. Outside, a man stood watching with hands that had built everything around him, the fences, the barn, the additions to the house, the life worth living. Wade Harlow had finally found what he'd been searching for all along. Not escape, not safety, not even peace exactly, but something better. Purpose, partnership, and the simple everyday joy of building a life with someone brave enough to build it beside him. He'd come to Montana looking for nothing but temporary work. Instead, he'd found everything that mattered, and he'd never ride away again.